Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where the air is thick with smoke. Your boots are always damp, and the street beneath you squelches like an old sponge. The mud clings to your soles as if it has a personal vendetta, and you swear the puddle you just stepped in blinked at you. Somewhere in the dark a cat yowls, a cat that, statistically speaking, probably has a better diet than you. You probably won't survive this, but at least you'll get a good story out of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's a blend of tallow smoke, damp wool, and whatever the tanner down the street has been boiling this week. Candlelight flickers along the uneven walls of timber houses, the glow catching on warped glass panes that distort the faces peering out. You tread carefully. The cobbles where they exist are slick with rainwater, and worse. Chamber pots are emptied with casual disregard from second-story windows, a fact you remember a split second too late. Your breath clouds in the cool evening air, mixing with the smoke of cooking fires that hover like a low fog. Somewhere nearby, a smith's hammer strikes rhythmically, ring, 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 punctuating the shouts of a fishmonger advertising his fresh catch. Historians still argue whether medieval towns were truly more foul-smelling than ancient cities, but here you wouldn't stake your health on the answer. A hunched figure passes you, pulling a cart of firewood, so damp it hisses angrily when fed to a hearth. You follow the glimmer of torchlight to a small square where a group has gathered around a storyteller. His voice is low, hypnotic, weaving tales of saints and monsters, though in this town the two categories overlap more often than you'd expect. Above it all the sky hangs heavy, clouds swollen and dark. The rain begins again, soft at first, then insistent, making the mud underfoot behave like a living thing. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling its damp weight against your shoulders. Somewhere in the crowd, a child laughs, a bright, clear sound that cuts through the grime of the evening like a bell. You wonder if she knows something you don't, or if she's just too young to care about wet feet. You pass a baker's shop, the warm scent of bread almost making you forget the gnaw in your stomach. Almost. But the price for a loaf is beyond you tonight. So you keep walking, your shadow stretching and shrinking in the flicker of nearby lanterns. The buildings lean in close, like gossiping neighbours, their upper stories nearly touching over your head. A rat darts across your path, vanishing into a gap beneath the cooper's workshop. You think about the diseases whispered through town, the fevers that creep into homes and leave empty chairs at the table. You shake the thought away, focusing instead on the sensation of your boots squelching, each step another reminder that comfort is a luxury here. There's a peculiar beauty in it though, the way the light catches on the wet cobbles, the quiet dignity of those hauling their burdens, the soft hum of voices blending into a single, living breath of the city. Somewhere, a church bell tolls the hour, slow and sonorous, marking another piece of the night sliding by. You pause beneath an overhanging roof, watching droplets race each other off the edge. Your fingers are cold, but you feel strangely awake, present in this moment where survival is measured not in years but in warm meals and dry boots. The mud, the candle smoke, the closeness of the streets, they're all part of the same stubborn pulse that keeps this town alive. You wake to the scent of bread, or something that claims to be bread, mingling with the heavier, more suspicious aroma of boiled meat. The morning light, pale and reluctant, slips in through the small window above your head, catching the dust motes that dance in the chill air. Your stomach tightens, and not in the poetic way. It's been a while since your last proper meal, and your dreams have been full of roast chickens that, frankly, mocked you by flying away before you could take a bite. The town's baker is already at work, his arms dusted with flour, his face pink from the heat of the oven. The bread looks hearty enough, but you've heard stories, some loaves bulked out with ground beans, powdered chalk, even sawdust when wheat was scarce. Historians still argue whether these fillers were deliberate fraud or desperate necessity. Either way, you bite too hard and you risk cracking a tooth. In the corner of the market square, a pot of gruel simmers, thin, grey, and utterly unenthusiastic about being food. A woman stirs it slowly, her expression saying she's as bored of it as you are. A ladleful costs less than bread, but you know it'll taste faintly of whatever grain dust and water happened to be handy that morning. Still, it's warm, and in a medieval winter, warmth is its own kind of luxury. Then there's the meat stall. The butcher's selection is variable. Strips of salted pork hang from hooks, their edges hardened like leather. A few suspiciously small pies rest on a shelf. Their crusts golden, but their fillings a mystery you're not sure you want solved. You've heard rumours of meat recycled from animals that died on their own, and you know the saying, if you don't ask, it's just lunch. A small boy tugs at his mother's sleeve, pointing to a string of sausages. They glisten in the cold, and you wonder how much of that sheen is from actual fat and how much from the morning frost. You catch yourself, imagining biting into one, rich, savoury, spiced, before remembering last week's case of food poisoning that had half the tavern laid up for days. Somewhere in the bustle, a man offers pies with a wink, swearing on his honour. They're pigeon, not rat. He's holding the pigeon upside down for proof, though the bird looks more like a prop than a future dinner. You chuckle despite yourself. Humour, after all, is one of the few seasonings that costs nothing. The bread stall calls to you again, and you finally hand over a coin for a small round loaf. It's heavier than it looks. The crust tough enough that you need both hands to tear it apart. The inside is dense, almost damp, but it carries that unmistakable scent of baked grain. A chunk warms your fingers, and when you chew, the flavour is plain, but comforting. You've tasted worse, much worse. Remember that meat stew you had on the road last month? The one that might have been half turnip and half optimism? Nearby, a brewer pours out mugs of weak ale for workers heading to their day's labour. It's safer than water, at least that's the hope, and it takes the edge off the morning chill. You sip, feeling the faintest fizz on your tongue. The flavour is mild, a little sour, but it washes down the bread and leaves you ready to face the day. A woman selling cheese catches your eye. The wheel is small, wrapped in cloth, and smells faintly of hay. She tells you it's from her own goat, and while you suspect she's told the same story to everyone, the bite she offers is tangy and surprisingly fresh. You tuck the taste away in your memory, the way a miser tucks away a coin. The market hums around you, boots scuffing against cobbles, coins clinking in pouches, the sizzle of something frying on an iron pan. A vendor laughs too loudly at his own joke about the fish being so fresh it swam here. You can't tell if it's true, but the scent of salt water clings to his stall. You wander past the last row of food sellers, your stomach fuller than it was, but still far from satisfied. The smells linger on your clothes, the yeast of bread, the tang of cheese, the ghost of smoked meat. In this town, food isn't about delight, it's about survival, with a pinch of luck and a dash of boldness. And as you chew the final bite of your bread, you realise you've gotten through breakfast without breaking a tooth or regretting a single mouthful. For today, that's victory enough. The rooster's call isn't so much a cheerful greeting to the day as it is a blunt reminder that you're already late. You pull yourself up from the straw-stuffed mattress, the faint ache in your back telling you the day's work started before you even stood up. The room is cold, your breath curling in faint mist as you drag on your wool tunic, still smelling faintly of smoke from last night's fire. Outside, the first pale light is smudging the horizon, and the air is thick with dew. You step into the yard, boots squelching against soil that hasn't quite decided if it wants to be mud or frost. Somewhere nearby, a cow lowing in complaint is answered by the soft cluck of hens shuffling in their coop. The smell of manure is sharp but familiar. It's the scent of necessity, the quiet backbone of the life you're living. The morning's first chore is water. The well stands just beyond the edge of your small plot, its bucket cold and slick from the night air. You crank the rope, feeling the weight of water rise slowly, each creak of the pulley matching the pull in your shoulders. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were truly up with the sun, or if they woke in shifts through the night and morning. But one thing's clear, you're not doing any of this in bed. You carry the sloshing bucket back carefully, trying not to spill a drop. This water will see you through cooking, washing, and maybe even a quick rinse for your face if there's enough left over. Inside, the hearth is dark, so you crouch to coax yesterday's embers back to life, blowing until a small flame licks at the kindling. The warmth is slow to come, but it's a comfort all the same. Once the animals are fed, the chickens pecking at grain, the pig snorting gratefully at its trough, you turn to the fields. The soil is cool under your hands as you pull weeds from between struggling shoots of barley. The work is repetitive, the kind that sets your mind drifting. You think of the coming harvest, of whether the weather will be kind or cruel this year. You remember last autumn, when rain rotted half the crop before it could be brought in. Your stomach growls, but breakfast isn't a leisurely affair. A chunk of yesterday's bread, dipped briefly in the bucket to soften it, will have to do. The crust soaks up the water unevenly, leaving parts chewy and others just soggy enough to make you wince. You eat quickly, because every moment spent sitting is another moment the day's work waits, silently judging you. From the edge of the field, you can see smoke rising from other cottages, thin and grey against the morning sky. Your neighbours are out too, some hauling tools, others already bent over their own plots. You trade a brief wave with a man carrying a wooden rake over his shoulder. The gesture is wordless, but says, "Yes, we're all in this together, whether we like it or not." The sun climbs higher, its warmth chasing away the chill. You feel the sweat start to bead at the back of your neck, your tunic sticking slightly to your skin. The rhythm of the day settles in. Pull, dig, plant, water, repeat. Occasionally, you straighten up to stretch your back, glancing at the tree line, where crows watch with patient, opportunistic eyes. At midday, you pause to drink from the bucket, the water cool and metallic on your tongue. A neighbour's child runs past, chasing a dog that looks far too pleased with itself for stealing a strip of cloth from someone's wash line. You smile despite yourself. Small moments of amusement are as vital as bread here. In the distance, a church bell tolls, marking a time you can't really afford to stop for. Still, you lean on your hoe for a few breaths, feeling the air in your lungs, the weight in your arms. This is the kind of tired that wraps around you like a blanket, earned, honest, unavoidable. By the time you trudge back toward the cottage, the light has shifted again, the shadows stretching longer across the fields. You'll still need to patch the fence before nightfall, and the thought makes your legs feel heavier. But for now, there's a quiet satisfaction in seeing the rows of barley standing straighter than they did this morning. It's not glory, and it's certainly not riches, but it's survival. And in this world, that's more than enough. You step out of the mud and into a mansion that promises refuge, and immediately discover that wealth buys height, banners, and an audience for your jokes, but not, apparently, a mop. The wooden door swings behind you with a groan, trapping the smells of horse, hearth, and humanity in a grand hall where smoke drifts up like lazy ghosts toward a ceiling that's trying and failing to remember what clean air feels like. Your boots, still carrying the street's finest sludge, meet a floor strewn with rushes and sweet herbs meant to scent the room and hide spills. You look down. The rushes are doing both jobs with mixed success, like a helpful cousin who keeps offering advice and dropping the plates. Servants glide past, quick and quiet, their arms full of trenchers and jugs, while at the high table a pair of nobles unfold themselves like cats in sunshine. They wear fabrics that shimmer, silk that whispers when they move, wool dyed deep as wine, fur warming collars against the draught that sneaks through every crack. You can almost taste the perfume in the air, rosewater, orange blossom, and a darker note that you can't place until a memory surfaces. Ambergris, that odd treasure from a whale's wandering gut, prized for making scents last longer. You make a mental note. If anyone asks about your new signature fragrance, call it ocean mystery, not beached surprise. Your path takes you along the edge of the hall, where you dodge a dog sleeping heroically next to a platter like a furry moat. The floor crunches faintly under your step. Remember the baker's bread crust from this morning? Imagine 1,000 crumbs living their best lives right here. Mixed among the rushes you spot fish bones, a wilted sprig of rosemary, and something that once dreamed of being a grape. Tonight, this entire carpet will receive another layer of herbs, lavender, meadowsweet, maybe mint, to keep the air sweet. Tomorrow, it will smell like a garden that lost a bar fight with a pantry. At the hearth, a noblewoman leans close to the firelight, dabbing at her wrists with a scented cloth. The perfume blooms, civet and musk wrapped in citrus, and cuts through the hearth smoke as decisively as a knight through a cheese wheel. A mainstream fact settles into the scene. Medieval elites loved perfume and hygiene rituals more than the mud streets myth suggests, rinsing hands between courses, passing ewers and towels, and washing faces with fragrant waters. Historians still argue whether the wealthy in different regions bathed as often as later tales claim, but there's no denying they had the budget for rose water, soap from olive oil and lye, and pomanders filled with cloves to swing like pocket-sized breezes. A steward ushers you toward a side passage where polished wood gleams like caramel under torchlight. The scent changes, beeswax and linen, because here the household flexes its order. Clothes are brushed, not laundered daily, but when they are washed. The recipe might include ashlie, stale urine for the toughest grease. You clear your throat and pretend you didn't hear that, and a slap press routine that could beat a drum into submission. A fringe tidbit slips into your ear. Some noble wardrobes included tooth powders of ground oyster shell or burnt rosemary, rubbed with a linen rag. Your modern dentist screams faintly in the distance, but your breath thanks you. Through a heavy door, you enter the solar, a warmer, more private family space with tapestries softening the draught. A lute plucks somewhere, strings sighing like a cat finally allowed on the chair. You're offered wine mulled with cinnamon, and a few suspicious sticks billed as exotic bark, which might also double as kindling if times get tight. The nobleman beside you jokes about last winter's snow creeping under the door like a burglar. He laughs, then adds a sleepy yawn, because even rank has to negotiate with the cold. You sip, and the spice warms your tongue, an improvement over the weak ale that carried you through breakfast. Progress. Tiny, delicious progress. Courtiers drift in. A falconer with leather glove. A chaplain who smells faintly of vellum and patience. A lady whose hair glints with oil, perfumed by bay leaves. Conversation slides from trade routes to tapestry patterns, to which cousin forgot to tip the minstrels. The filth of the hall is out of sight for a breath or two, and you almost believe luxury is spotless, until a small dog trots in carrying a stolen roll, pursued by a page who negotiates politely with a creature that has no intention of negotiating. The roll sheds crumbs like a nervous comet, and the floor gratefully collects them for later. A servant offers a bowl of rose water and a towel before the meal, and you dip your fingers, feeling the floral coolness chase the day's grit from your skin. The kitchen door swings wide, and waves of scent roll out. Roasted fowl, pepper, a hint of almond. You take your place at a long trestle where trenchers, stale bread plates, wait to absorb sauce and dignity in equal measure. A hand-washing ritual flows down the table. Rings glint, Napkins, for those who have them, are neatly draped. Beneath, the rushes keep their secrets. The first course arrives and you remember Section 2's dubious pies with fondness. Because this is better. Spiced, rich, intentional. A mainstream detail lands. Pepper is prized, imported along complex routes, and measured like treasure. The nobleman boasts about a shipment that arrived intact. You nod wisely, as if you too keep pepper scriptures. Someone mentions that bathing is fashionable in certain towns with bathhouses. Yes, even for nobles who book private rooms, order food, and talk business in hot water like very relaxed diplomats. A debate drifts in. Historians still argue whether these bathhouses declined mainly because of moralizing crackdowns, disease fears, or shifts in fashion and fuel. Costs. You quietly decide any place with hot water is a place of virtue. Between courses, an attendant spritzes the air with orange blossom water, a lovely attempt at meteorology, localised showers of nice smells. But the hall is the hall. Dogs, people, smoke, supper. You recall the marketplace eel from earlier, then decide not to ask about the fish course. Joke one slides in gently. You tell yourself the fish is so fresh, it wrote you a farewell letter, and you eat anyway. A lady at your elbow shows you a pomander, silver filigree opening to cloves, nutmeg, and a curl of dried lemon. She says it keeps bad air at bay. You nod, inhaling quietly, and let the spice rewrite the room. Another soft joke lands. You consider inventing the first medieval air freshener commercial. Are your rushes rushing toward chaos? Try pomander. Now with 30% more, please don't smell that. You keep it to yourself. The chaplain looks humour averse. As the night leans in, musicians take the gallery. The sound shimmers above the chatter, a net catching laughter and letting it fall back down in softer pieces. You wander to a window slit and press your palm to the stone. The chill is honest, clean. Down in the yard, a stable hand forks straw. A scullion tips a bucket that splashes, hesitates, and disappears into the earth. Everything here is a trade between effort and gravity. You circle back to the hearth where a servant, practical as gravity itself, rakes out a section of the rushes and tosses the damp, matted tangle outside, then shakes in a fresh layer with handfuls of thyme and lavender. The transformation is immediate, like changing sheets on a very large, very public bed. It's better. Not perfect, but better. Joke 3 arrives with a yawn. You imagine starting a startup called Rushes as a Service, promising quarterly herb refreshes and an optional rat mitigation premium. Investors blink. Dogs nod. Before you leave, you're guided down a narrow corridor to a guardrobe, a stone seat over a chute that drops toward the moat's future. A small slit lets in air, and a bowl of petals sits nearby, because even necessities deserve a flourish. You emerge both lighter and more convinced that luxury is a spectrum with drafts at every price point. By the time you step back into the hall, the perfume has married the smoke into a surprisingly gentle lullaby. The floor, freshly reherbed, releases a sigh of time every time someone walks by. Perfume and filthy floors coexist here, like nobility and necessity, holding hands under the table. You pull your cloak close, pocket a mint sprig for later, and let your eyelids weigh down in the warm flutter of music and spice. If the streets outside are mud and candle smoke, the noble interior is gloss and time. Neither one as clean nor as dirty as the stories say. Just human, layered and alive. The echo hits you first, a slow measured rhythm of voices rising and falling in perfect unison, like waves against a shore that's never seen the sea. You step into the cloister, where the stone floor is cool underfoot, and the air smells faintly of beeswax, parchment, and the faint dampness of centuries. The walls are lined with narrow windows, their pale light slicing across rows of monks seated at heavy wooden desks. Each man is hunched forward, his back curved like a question mark, his hand guiding a quill that scratches quietly against vellum. The sound is hypnotic, steady, scratch, dip, scratch, punctuated only by the occasional soft cough or the creak of a bench shifting under a tired spine. Here, time feels syrup thick. Your boots feel too loud, so you slow your step to match the hush, as though even your breathing might smudge the careful letters being born on those pages. A mainstream historical fact drifts in. Medieval monastic scriptoria were the great photocopiers of their age, producing copies of religious texts, classical works, and the occasional practical manual. The monks often worked in silence for hours, breaking only for prayer or the slow, careful sharpening of a quill. Each page could take days to complete, the ink made from oak gall and iron salts, the letters sometimes dressed in gold leaf, so fine it seemed to glow from within. You glance over one monk's shoulder. His page blooms with careful black lines, the first letter a riot of colour and pattern, interlaced vines, tiny birds, a dragon curling in the negative space. Your mind trips over the patience it takes to make something so elaborate, especially when your only audience is another monk, 2 benches away. Historians still argue whether the more playful flourishes, faces hidden in the margins, rabbits wielding swords, were acts of rebellion, private jokes, or simply an accepted outlet for human whimsy in an otherwise rigid routine. The air is still except for the faint flutter of a page turning and the soft clink of a sand shaker, dusting fresh ink so it won't smear. A monk dips his quill again, his expression so serene you wonder if he's aware of the time passing at all. You try to imagine the hours stretching ahead, each one carved into the shape of a single column of text. The thought makes your shoulders itch, but there's also a strange peace in it. The way a tide coming in knows it has all the time in the world. In a corner, a novice is tasked with grinding pigments. He leans over a slab of stone, working a pestle in small patient circles, his fingertips stained blue from lapis lazuli, green from malachite. The colours pool like tiny seas in ceramic dishes, waiting for the moment they'll transform a flat sheet into something luminous. A fringed tidbit bubbles up. Ultramarine pigment, made from lapis mined in Afghanistan, was worth more than gold in some parts of Europe, and its use was often reserved for the robes of the Virgin. Mary in illuminated manuscripts. The chanting from earlier drifts back into earshot, a low hum from the chapel, just beyond the cloister. The sound blends with the scent of candle smoke and fresh ink, turning the room into something that feels almost outside of time. One monk pauses to flex his cramped fingers, shaking them out before returning to his work. Another reaches for a knife, not for violence, but to gently scrape away an error, smoothing the surface so the vellum can accept the ink again. You take a seat at an empty desk, running your fingers over the faint grooves left by years of writing. The bench is hard, the angle awkward, and you last all of 2 minutes before your knees begin to complain. The idea of doing this for decades feels like a different kind of endurance, less about strength and more about surrender. In the refectory, when the bell finally calls them to a meal, the monks file out in silence. The long tables hold bread, pottage, and maybe a wedge of cheese, if fortune has been kind this week. A single reader stands at a lectern, speaking scripture aloud as the others eat. No chatter, no clink of mugs, just the steady cadence of words and the sound of chewing, both oddly meditative. After the meal, the bell will call them back to their desks, their quills, their quiet battle with time. You slip out into the cloister garden, where herbs grow in neat squares, sage, mint and rosemary, breathing their fragrance into the cool air. A monk passes you carrying a basket of lavender, bound for the infirmary. You imagine its scent mingling with candle smoke and vellum, just another thread in the tapestry of monastery life. As you turn toward the gatehouse, the chanting swells again. You pause, letting it wash over you. It's not your rhythm, not your pace, but for a moment, It's easy to believe that this slow, deliberate life, monotony and all, might hold its own kind of quiet wonder. The day starts promising enough. Clear skies, a faint breeze, and the smell of fresh-turned soil drifting across the fields. You're halfway through repairing the thatch on your roof when the first warning arrives. A strange hush, as if the birds have collectively agreed to take an ominous lunch break. You glance toward the horizon. A dark smear is gathering there, low and wide, like ink soaking into the edge of the world. By the time you climb down, the air feels different, thicker, charged, as though it's about to confess something unpleasant. A gust shivers through the trees, bringing with it the metallic scent of rain, the kind that doesn't politely knock before it arrives. Somewhere in the village, a door slams shut against the wind. You pick up your pace. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers truly read the weather better than modern folk, or whether we've simply romanticised their guesswork. Standing here, with the horizon eating the sky and your thatch still half finished, you feel pretty certain that experience, or maybe just fear, has sharpened your own weather instincts. You don't need a saint's vision to know you've got minutes, not hours. By the time you herd the chickens into their coop, the first fat drops are hitting the ground, darkening the dust into spots. You duck inside just as the rain turns aggressive, rattling against the shutters like it's trying to come in for tea. The light fades, replaced by a dim grey gloom that makes the small room feel even smaller. You pull your cloak tight, the dampness already seeping into the edges of your sleeves. Then comes the hail. It starts with a hesitant tap-tap, but quickly gains confidence, drumming against the roof in a furious rattle. The noise is so loud you can't hear yourself think, which is probably for the best, because the only thought you're having is please let the roof hold. You imagine your barley field outside, tender green shoots flattened under icy pellets. A mainstream fact flashes in your mind. Before reliable storage and transport, a single bad storm at the wrong time could mean famine. No wonder weather was treated with both reverence and suspicion. Too much rain or too little, and the village's survival tilted on its edge. People prayed to saints for clear skies, held processions, even rang church bells to break storms. Though historians debate whether the bells were meant to scare away the devil, or just announce to the neighbours that the weather was everyone's problem now. In the corner, a draught pushes through the shutter's gap, and you stuff a rag into it, muttering about whoever invented the idea of windows without proper hinges. A sudden flash of lightning makes the whole room glow for a breath, followed by the deep, rolling growl of thunder. You count under your breath, 1, 2, 3, before another crack splits the air, closer this time. From the door, you catch a glimpse of the lane. Water is already running in muddy rivulets, carrying twigs, straw, and the occasional confused chicken toward the lower end of the village. Somewhere, a dog is barking at the storm, apparently confident it can win the argument. After a while, the hail stops, replaced by steady, soaking rain. You step outside under the overhang, watching the water bead on the thatch and run down in thick, glistening ropes. The barley field looks bruised but still standing, at least from here. You know you'll have to walk it later, squelching through the mud to see what the storm has claimed. A fringe tidbit comes to mind. Some medieval households kept weather charms, bundles of herbs, carved runes, even tiny wax models of the sun, hung in doorways or tucked into rafters. Whether they worked or not was beside the point. Sometimes, you just needed to feel like you were doing something against the sky's moods. The storm finally begins to ease, the clouds breaking apart into torn grey sails drifting east. Sunlight filters through in cautious streaks, touching the wet earth and making it steam faintly. Birds start up again, tentative at first, then louder, as though they've decided the crisis has passed. You walk down the lane, boots sinking into the softened ground, passing neighbours already emerging to assess the damage. One man tips his cap to you before crouching to free a stuck wheel from the mud. Children splash in puddles, blissfully unaware of the yield calculations their parents are already making in their heads. Back at your own plot, you trail your fingers through the battered barley. Some stalks lean at awkward angles, others stand stubbornly upright. It's not all lost, not yet. But you feel the weight of the coming weeks, more storms maybe, or a dry spell that will finish what the hail began. For now, though, the air is clean, the worst has passed, and you let yourself breathe with the land, both of you bruised but still here. The rain from the morning has left the streets slick and gleaming, puddles reflecting the sagging timber frames of the buildings around you. You follow the flow of voices toward the marketplace, your boots sliding just enough to make you question whether you'll end up buying vegetables or just falling face first into them. The air is thick with competing scents: fresh bread, wood smoke, fish that may or may not still be legal to sell, and the sharp tang of pickled cabbage drifting from an open barrel. The square opens up before you, a jostling knot of stalls draped in rough cloth awnings. The ground here is a mess of trampled straw meant to soak up the mud, but it's losing the fight. Vendors call out in sing-song pitches, each insisting their goods are better, cheaper, and definitely less likely to kill you than their neighbours. Historians still argue whether medieval markets were truly the centres of community life they're often painted to be, or if they were more like necessary chores, noisy, smelly, and slightly exhausting. Standing here, you suspect both might be true. To your left, a man is selling onions by the rope, the bulbs fat and streaked with dirt, their papery skins rattling in the breeze. He winks at you as you pass, declaring that his onions will put the courage in your heart and the tears in your enemy's eyes. Next to him, a woman in a wool shawl arranges skeins of dyed yarn in reds, blues, and a particularly alarming shade of yellow. She pats one bundle and assures you it's sun fast, which you take to mean it will fade only slightly faster than your patience. The centre aisle of the market is more chaotic. A boy waves a jug of something that might be cider, or might be regret in liquid form. A tanner's stall releases a wave of sharp animal hide scent that nearly makes you turn back. But you press on, drawn by the strange and wonderful things you can only seem to find here. At one table, a merchant proudly displays a glass jar holding a very pale eel suspended in cloudy liquid. He tells you it's a delicacy, pickled and spiced, a treat for feast days. You're not sure whether to be impressed or concerned about its milky stare. This is the sort of oddity you only find when you're willing to wade through the noise, and you tuck it away in your mind. Maybe for a dare, maybe for a story. A mainstream historical fact pops into place. Markets weren't just about buying and selling. They were hubs for information, gossip, and even unofficial matchmaking. People came not only to stock up on grain or fabric, but to learn who was marrying whom, what the price of salt was in the next town over, and whether the miller's apprentice had really been caught napping in the flour bin again. You stop at a spice merchant stall, where the air seems to change entirely. The aromas here are warm and exotic: cinnamon, pepper, cloves, each stored in neat cones or tied in cloth packets. The merchant's hands move with reverence as he scoops a small measure into a paper twist, telling you it travelled across seas and deserts to reach your palm. You imagine the chain of hands it passed through, each one marking up the price, just enough to make your coin purse wince. A fringe tidbit slips into your thoughts. In some towns, market inspectors, called ale wardens or bread weighers, patrolled the stalls to make sure goods met certain standards. Of course, whether those standards were fair or whether the inspectors could be bribed is another debate entirely. The sounds of the market shift as a musician sets up near the fountain, plucking at a lute while a small crowd gathers. Children weave through the press of bodies carrying small purchases or just chasing each other around the barrels. A man selling ribbons lets a length of red silk flutter in the wind, catching the light like a flag. You watch as it disappears into the pocket of a quick-fingered passer-by who melts into the crowd before the seller even turns around. You finally settle on buying a small wedge of cheese, a loaf of bread and, because you can't resist, the tiniest jar of honey you've ever seen. The seller assures you the bees were blessed by a priest, which sounds either quaint or slightly threatening. The bread is still warm in your hands as you turn to leave, and the honey glows amber in the pale afternoon light. As you walk back through the muddy lanes, the market's noise fading behind you, you can't help but think of it as a living thing, loud, unpredictable, and full of odd treasures if you're willing to look past the dirt. Music finds you before the torches do. A drum thumps at the end of the lane, and you sway as you step into the square, where straw pretends it can defeat mud, and the air smells of smoke and citrus peel. Banners run window to window. A fiddler tests a tune. Laughter loosens like it's been stored all winter. You edge into the swirl, guarding your tiny priest-blessed honey jar, as if joy could be bottled and rationed. The festival grows out of the market's bones. Stalls that sold onions at noon now pour hot spiced ale. A baker sets out cakes freckled with caraway. A butcher roasts pork until the fat sings. The music is a polite liar. It convinces your feet they're lighter than they are. A circle of dancers forms near the well. Hands linked, shoulders loose, a step even your barley-sore back can copy. The tune loops brighter. A boy trips, bows theatrically, and the crowd cheers him, like a hero who conquered gravity by losing to it. A girl with ribbons offers you a sprig of rosemary for fortune, and you tuck it into your sleeve, like a soldier pinning a medal. Joke 1 arrives softly. You decide you now smell like a knight of the herb table. Mainstream detail time. Feast days punctuate the calendar, tying work to worship. Harvest ales after reaping, carnivals before Lent, saints' days with processions and bells. Even thin-pursed towns manage a fire, a tune, a shared loaf, because morale isn't a luxury here. It's equipment. The priest moves through the crowd with a lantern, blessing babies and nodding at the ale. Lanterns bob as a procession curls past the church. A relic rides high in embroidered linen. You bow with the tide, because tonight the tide goes that way. Bells answer, silver, iron, and a cracked little note you privately adore. Historians still argue whether these boisterous nights mostly masked anxieties about weather, disease, and hunger, or genuinely release them like steam from a kettle. The truth probably dances between. Back in the square, mummers tumble onto a plank stage, a cardboard-crowned king, a saint with a halo of rushes, not the rushes as a service premium tier, and a dragon that is definitely two cousins under a quilt. The jokes are broad, the moral is tidy, greed punished, generosity rewarded. You laugh because it's funny, and because your ribs needed stretching. A fringe tidbit sidles in. Some villages kept hobby horses and antlered disguises for yearly use. Near the bread stall, a clack and slap game with bones and painted sticks draws a ring of betters. You're tempted, but your coin is allergic to risk, so you settle for another sip of warm ale. A piper joins the fiddler, and the melody turns springy. Less march, more bounce. A woman with a voice like honeyed iron sings of a sailor who promised to return after one more tide, which you recognise as folk song for "Do Not Wait Up." Then a flash along the edge, rat probably. The mood barely ripples, it's part of the landscape, like knots in wood. Someone's terrier charges and returns triumphant with a shoe. It found more cooperative than the rat. The owner claims they meant to wear only one shoe tonight for better traction. Joke 2 lands with a sleepy grin, and you decide not to audit the claim. Children build a small kingdom beside the church wall, bartering candied nuts for pebbles with exotic reputations. A boy brags his stone came from the Emperor's Road, which may be true if emperors enjoy tripping. A girl rings a tiny bell and declares the square officially festive. You watch them whirl, each child a lantern of heat in the cooling air. A juggler lights 3 torches, sparks climb, hesitate, vanish into the velvet above. For a minute, the square quiets to the soft roar of flame and the ooh of 100 throats. Coins patter into the hat like small polite rain. Someone passes a pomander, cloves, dried lemon, a whisper of musk. You take a long, secret inhale. It is the olfactory opposite of your boots. You think of the noble hall's orange blossom showers and smile. The world keeps hiding nice smells inside its big stew. The dance changes. Pairs now, a turning step, a close-open close that makes even shy shoulders curious. You partner with the Rosemary Girl's grandmother, who leads with the serene authority of a woman who intends to outdance winter itself. Historians still argue whether reports of dance manias were mass psychogenic events, religious ecstasies, or chroniclers exaggerating a few wild nights into legend. The fiddler doesn't care. The drum doesn't care. Your feet absolutely do not care. Mid-evening, the reeve attempts a speech about keeping the peace and not price gouging the ale. The ale obeys for 9 minutes. A storyteller offers a saint's tale. Confronted with murderous hail, the saint negotiated until the stones shrank into beads and became a farmer's rosary. You decide this is exactly the sort of supply chain innovation the village needs. Food, then. A man sells hot wafers stamped with small crosses. A woman pours thickened milk into cups and dusts it with cinnamon. You buy a wafer, then immediately buy another, because generosity begins at home, and your home is your mouth. Joke 3 nods contentedly, while you hum the chorus you swore you would not learn, then learn it anyway. As midnight approaches, measured not by clocks but by the angle of stars above the weathercock, and the number of yawns you disguise as stretches, the square softens, laughter lowers its voice, couples practice the ancient art of leaning. Your sleeve rosemary bruises a green thumbprint into the cloth. Before the last tune, the priest returns with a pocket-sized blessing you can carry home. It lands like warmth on a cold knuckle. The final circle forms, everyone, even the reluctant dog with the shoe. Hands touch hands. The pace eases. The melody settles into a cradle. You sway, mouth the refrain, and let the day's ache loosen. When the song ends, a hush arrives so comfortable it almost counts as sleep. Then the square exhales. Good nights, see yous, the clink of cups collecting themselves. On the walk back, the mud resumes negotiations with your boots. Lanterns gutter, far roof silver with dew. You tuck the last bite of wafer into your cheek and promise your bed you are, at last, on your way. Festivals don't fix hunger, hail, or the long arithmetic of work, but they lend you a pocket of music to carry through the week. And tonight, pockets feel like treasure. The night air shifts again, not with music this time, but with the dry, powdery scent of something ancient. You've wandered from the mud and straw of the medieval streets into a place far older, where sand replaces cobbles, and the horizon stretches until it blurs. The marketplace here is smaller, quieter, and brighter under the hard sun. Traders call to one another in a language that feels warm in your ears, even if you only understand a word here or there. Somewhere, a camel groans like a door hinge that's been asked to open one too many times. You find yourself in front of a low, whitewashed stall draped in linen awnings. A woman sits cross-legged behind a tray of tiny pots, some glazed, some simple clay, each holding powder in shades of green, black, and dusty brown. She gestures to one of the green mounds and says something you do understand. Malachite. You know this stone, crushed into powder, was once the height of ancient beauty fashion. A mainstream fact surfaces. Egyptian men and women used malachite and coal not only as cosmetics, but also as a form of eye protection. The dark lines reducing glare from the relentless sun and possibly even helping ward off certain eye infections. She offers you a small copper mirror, its surface warped and clouded, and a thin stick for application. You lean in and tentatively drag the stick through the black powder. The coal feels smooth, cool against your skin, like drawing with smoke. Your reflection looks strange and dramatic, fierce in a way you've never quite seen yourself before. A child giggles nearby, perhaps at the unevenness of your lines. Joke 1 arrives uninvited. You tell yourself it's not smudged, it's mysteriously windswept. As you set the mirror down, the woman adds a dab of green malachite powder to your other lid. It shimmers faintly in the light, a flash of something almost otherworldly. Historians still argue whether the bright green was worn more for ritual, medicine, or sheer vanity. The truth, as always, may be all three. You imagine the faces of artisans, priests, and merchants catching the sun with the same shimmer, each with their own reasons. A fringe tidbit drifts into the heat. Some ancient Egyptian cosmetics were mixed with animal fat or gum resin to help the pigment stick, meaning your glamorous eye paint might also be an unintentional snack for flies. You try not to think about it as you brush a bit of sand from your cheek. Around you, the rest of the market hums. A man haggles over a basket of figs, the fruit splitting slightly in the heat, their scent rich and syrupy. A group of women carry folded linen, the cloth so white it seems to glow in the sunlight. A scribe at a nearby table copies neat rows of hieroglyphs onto papyrus, his reed pen moving quickly but precisely. You catch the faint, sweet smell of the papyrus sheets, warming in the sun. Someone passes with a jar of scented oil, the fragrance blooming into the air. Lotus and myrrh, light but insistent. It clings for a moment before the desert breeze steals it away. You imagine blending that scent with your new eye paint, the combination marking you as someone who understands both fashion and survival in this place. A small mirror shard catches the glare, flashing like a signal. You turn and find a man holding a tray of amulets, scarabs, ankhs, tiny falcon heads, each carved from stone or cast in copper. He leans in and whispers that one of them will keep the evil eye away from your own. You're not sure if it's a sales pitch or genuine concern, but you choose one shaped like the eye of Horus and slip it into your pouch. The heat presses down heavier now, and the crowd begins to thin. Traders pull their wares under shade, and even the camels kneel in the sand, chewing slowly, like they've learned the art of waiting out the sun. You take one last look at your reflection in the copper mirror, the green and black stark against your skin. It's not perfect, but then again, neither is the sand, or the sun, or the wind, and yet all three have outlasted more than anyone could count. You step away from the stall, the scent of mineral powder and lotus oil trailing you, and blend back into the drifting current of the marketplace. Somewhere ahead, the Nile shimmers in the distance, promising cool water and the next chapter of your journey. The road tilts downhill, the air softening with each step, until the grit of the desert gives way to packed earth worn as smooth by countless feet. Ahead, the hum of the ancient marketplace grows, a layered sound of bartering voices, bleating goats, and the slap of sandals against stone. You slip into its current, letting it pull you between stalls like a lazy river that's forgotten it has any business rushing. The first scent to hit is warm bread, flat loaves stacked like sunlit shields, quickly followed by the sharper tang of goat cheese sweating under the midday heat. A baker dusts his counter with flour, a pale cloud catching the light before settling on his arms. Beside him, a fishmonger works quickly, the Nile's catch laid out on wet reed mats, silver scales flashing in the sun. You catch yourself counting heartbeats between the scent of river fish and the breeze carrying something far less poetic from the goat pen nearby. A mainstream fact drifts into focus. Ancient markets were as much sensory spectacles as places of trade. Spices from across deserts, linen from distant fields, and copper from mountain mines all converged here, each with its own smell, texture, and weight in the hand. You realise you could navigate this place blindfolded just by the scents. The resinous sweetness of frankincense, the sour sting of vinegar from a pickling vat, the dusty musk of woven reed baskets. You pass a merchant pouring honey into clay jars, the golden ribbon catching the sunlight like molten amber. He grins, telling you it will sweeten a king's tongue. The though you suspect he says that to everyone with coin in their hand. A child trails behind him, with a fan made of palm leaves, shooing flies with the solemnity of a royal guard. The crowd thickens where the spice stalls begin. You lean in over a table piled with cinnamon sticks, dried hibiscus petals, and tiny cloth bundles tied with twine. The air here is warm with pepper and cumin, as if you've stepped into the memory of every feast you've ever smelled. The merchant holds out a pinch of ground coriander for you to taste on your tongue, sharp, citrusy, and bright enough to cut through the heat. A fringe tidbit surfaces. Some traders rub their hands with strong-smelling herbs before handling their goods, partly to mask the scent of the journey, partly to reassure customers that what they sold was fresh. You glance at the merchant's fingers, green stained from mint, nails neat, and figure it works. You duck under the shadow of an awning woven from palm fronds. Here, pottery jars are stacked in neat rows, each sealed with wax and marked with painted symbols. A fish for oil, a lotus for perfume, a zigzag for water drawn from a sacred spring. One jar is unsealed, releasing the heady scent of myrrh. You breathe it in, feeling the spice-laced air settle into your lungs like a slow exhale. Somewhere behind you, a trader and a customer raise their voices over the price of linen. Their argument slips between laughter and mock outrage, the kind of performance that probably ends with both of them claiming victory. Historians still argue whether such haggling was a matter of genuine economic necessity or a kind of social ritual, part theatre, part negotiation. Judging by the winks exchanged afterward, you suspect it's both. You pause at a stall where a woman sells woven mats. She runs her hands over the reed fibres as she talks, the same way a storyteller might gesture over her words. She tells you one mat was made for a temple, its pattern meant to echo the stars on the night of a great festival. The design spirals outward like a galaxy, and you can almost see the flicker of oil lamps mirrored in its weave. Your stomach reminds you you're not just here to observe. A man with a clay griddle flips small thin pancakes and folds them around spoonfuls of date paste. The first bite is hot enough to make your eyes water, but the sweetness settles quickly, clinging to your teeth in the most agreeable way. Joke one lands. You decide if you lived here, you'd spend all your coins on these and start a date-based economy. The sun shifts, throwing longer shadows through the lanes. A donkey cart rattles past, its driver calling for people to step aside. You notice the wheels are banded with copper, probably expensive, definitely noisy, and watch as it disappears toward the riverfront. The scent of water and wet rope drifts after it, hinting at another market entirely. Boats and barges unloading their goods under the evening sky. You make your way toward the edge of the square, honey jar safely tucked under your arm, date paste sweetness still lingering on your tongue. The air here feels lighter, cooler, touched by the faint breath of the Nile. The marketplace continues behind you, a steady, living thing that will be here tomorrow and the day after, always shifting but never entirely new. The hum of the market fades behind you, replaced by the slow, heavy beat of your own footsteps against the packed desert path. Ahead, the horizon wavers in the heat, but closer, much closer, the massive silhouette of a half-built stone wall rises like the ribs of some impossible beast. The air smells of dust and sweat, of limestone newly bitten by copper chisels. Every sound seems swallowed by the size of the thing, until a hammer's ring on stone cuts through, sharp and precise. You're pulled toward the construction site, almost against your will, the way the human eye can't help but track the sweep of a mountain. But this is no natural peak. It's deliberate, a pyramid in the making, its layers growing like a giant staircase to the sun. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Ancient Egyptian tombs, especially those for pharaohs, were colossal projects that could take decades and armies of skilled workers to complete. Far from the popular myth of constant whip cracking, much of the labour was done by paid workers, and seasonal crews rotating in from farming villages. A foreman passes by, calling out in a voice that carries without shouting. His linen kilt is dusted white, his skin shining with a thin sheen of oil against the sun. He stops to check the angle of a stone block before waving you toward the ramp that snakes up the pyramid's flank. The ramp is wide enough for teams of men to pass each other, some pulling sledges laden with massive stone, others descending with ropes and empty hands. You step aside as a group trudges upward, the wood of their sledge groaning under the weight. Each man leans forward into the rope, heels digging into the packed dirt. Sand grinds under their feet, like a living thing trying to hold them back. You catch one man's eye, and he flashes a brief, tired grin, just enough to remind you that humour survives even here. Joke one sidles in. You think to yourself that if anyone invented a rolling stone in this place, it wouldn't gather moss, but it would definitely gather praise. The sun hits you harder here. Even the wind feels like a slow exhale from an oven. A man working at the chisel breaks to sip from a clay jar of beer thin, cool, and safe to drink. You've heard that workers are given rations of bread, onions, and beer, a combination meant to keep them strong in the heat. A fringe tidbit comes to mind. Archaeologists have found graffiti carved into the stone blocks, left by the work gangs, team names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkor, equal parts pride and personality preserved in the bones of the monument. Near the base, a group is smoothing the face of a block with dolerite pounders, their movements rhythmic and strangely soothing. Chips of limestone fall in steady ticks, catching in their hair and sticking to their damp skin. The sound is soft compared to the clatter of the sledges, but it fills the air like a heartbeat. The foreman leads you to a shaded tent where a scribe sits cross-legged, recording deliveries of stone and tools on a fresh sheet of papyrus. His reed pen scratches quickly, the strokes clean and sure. He glances up at you, nods once, then goes back to his work without a word. Every tally, another stone in the invisible foundation of this place. You move on, drawn to the smell of bread baking in clay ovens nearby. The cooks work quickly, slapping flattened dough to the oven's inner wall, pulling it free with long sticks once it blisters and browns. Workers take the bread in cloth bundles, some eating it on the spot, others saving it for the long climb ahead. Above, a block slides into place with a deep, final-sounding thud. The men on the ropes cheer, the sound spilling down the ramp in a wave. Historians still argue about the exact methods used to move and position the stones, straight ramps, spiral ramps, internal passageways, but watching the coordination here, it's clear whatever the technique, it relies on precision and trust as much as muscle. As the sun leans westward, shadows pull between the stones. The day's work will end soon, though end is relative. There's always another block to haul, another surface to smooth. You stand at the pyramid's base and look up, the top lost against the glare. The sheer scale makes you feel small, but also tethered to something larger than yourself, something that will outlast sand, wind, and even the memory of the hands that built it. A man passes carrying a chisel over his shoulder, whistling a tune that feels older than the ramp under your feet. You find yourself walking back toward the river, with the rhythm of that whistle still in your ears, as if the stone itself has learned to sing. Night slides over the worksite like a linen veil, thin at first, then dark enough to soften every edge. The day's heat loosens its grip, and your shoulders finally unclench as a breeze wanders in from the river, cool and curious. You leave the clatter of stacked tools and follow a sandy path toward the dunes. The ground is still warm under your soles, storing sunlight the way your pouch stores crumbs of market bread. The air tastes faintly of dust and baking, like an oven that forgot to stop being an oven. You crest a low ridge, and the world opens. The pyramid's silhouette stands behind you, newly taller, its flanks a steep geometry cut out of night. Ahead, the desert rolls away in quiet waves. and above, the sky flowers with stars, so many, so insistent, that you feel for a moment like a tiny amphora set beneath a waterfall of light. You lie back and let the sand cradle you. It yields with a sigh, cool on the surface, warm underneath, like a polite bed that has been practicing hospitality since before beds were an idea. The first star that grabs your attention sits low in the east, bright, white, and conspiratorial. You imagine it winking, then remember the boatman's lesson. When Sirius Sopdet returns to the dawn, the Nile rises soon after, and the year turns new. A mainstream fact settles calmly beside you. The heliacal rising of Sirius marked the Egyptian New Year and foretold the inundation, the dependable flood that fed the fields and refilled the kingdom's patience. Time here is braided to the river and the sky. Closer overhead, a belt of 3 bright points tilts across the darkness. You trace them with a sandy finger, then glance back toward the pyramid, wondering at angles, alignments, and intentions. Historians still argue whether the Great Pyramids were deliberately arranged to echo Orion's belt, or whether the resemblance is a trick of pattern-hungry eyes. You decide either way, the comparison is flattering, for both the stones and the sky. Around you, the work camp settles. Fires shrink to coals, and voices drop to a murmur carried by the same breeze that lifts the corner of your linen. Someone plucks a 3-stringed lute, the notes walking slowly across the sand as if they're looking for their sandals. A pot of beer warms near a ring of stones, and the smell is friendly, grain a little sour, a hint of yesterday's laughter. A man you hauled rope with today offers the jar. You sip and hand it back, both of you performing that ancient ritual of, I taste it, you taste it, now it's definitely good. Joke one smiles and goes to bed early. You rub a little sweat-dried grit from your cheek and feel the faint trace of coal at your eyelid from the market stall, the black line stubbornly holding its ground against the day. A fringe tidbit rides the night air. Some cosmetic lead salts in coal may spur a tiny burst of nitric oxide in the skin, helping fend off minor infections. So your dramatic eye might be doing unglamorous work while you stargaze. You picture a physician nodding at your fashion choices, then charging you twice for them. The music fades, replaced by a quiet that isn't empty. The desert has its own low conversation. An insect ticking, a gecko's quick scratch, the distant thud of a camel settling with the relieved grunt of an old merchant dropping his pack. You think of the noble hall's time-crackling rushes and the village square's fiddlers, of rosemary pinned at your sleeve like a medal. Different nights, same human trick. Give darkness a smell, a song, a shared cup, and it begins behaving like a friend. You turn your head and meet the pyramid's edge again, a black wedge biting a piece from the stars. Surveyors spent the day with chords and shadows, as if coaxing straight lines from the sun itself. Another mainstream detail tucks in. Astronomer priests tracked deacons, small star groups rising in sequence through the night, using them as sky clocks for timekeeping and for the long pulse of ritual. Your body believes in those clocks now. Your breath has found the slower gear where sleep is parked. From another fire, a storyteller begins, not loud, not formal, just enough for anyone awake to catch a thread. Osiris rides the river of night. Isis hunts light with patient hands. The soul becomes a bird and weighs its heart against a feather that has never once lied. You imagine breath lifting from sleepers as small birds, winging toward the moon, and then returning, defeated by the warm gravity of blankets. Joke too perches quietly. If your heart were weighed tonight, you'd ask for a do-over on the extra slice of sweet cake. You roll to your stomach and draw a quick map in the sand. 3 stars for the belt, a rectangle for the base, a crooked path for the ramp like a snake too honest to pretend it isn't a snake. The wind smooths your lines even as you make them. That feels right. Here, permanence is a negotiation. Even stone keeps signing the paperwork. The breeze freshens, tasting faintly of river and reeds. In it, you can almost smell lotus oil from the day's market. Or maybe that's memory being theatrical. You press your amulet, the Eye of Horus, through your shirt and feel the cool of copper against your palm. Your thoughts drift to boats sliding at night, carrying stone, grain and secrets. Historians still argue whether workers lived at the site year-round or rotated strictly with agricultural seasons. You decide the truth probably shifts like the river's edge, firm in daylight, redrawn by morning. Beyond the camp, the dunes glow faintly, a silver sigh under the constellations. You imagine a jackal stepping along a crest, paws not quite touching the earth, and understand why gods borrow animal faces here. The shapes fit the landscape, like good sandals. Somewhere a laugh opens, quick and soft, then folds away. The coals blink, eyes growing drowsy. You tilt, your head back, until your headscarf slips and the sky pours straight in. If the day belonged to muscle and measure, the night belongs to margin notes. In the dark you admit small things. Your hands hurt. You miss the baker's daughter's lopsided rolls. You are, despite everything, a little proud of the block you helped settle today. Joke 3 yawns. You consider asking the stars to sign your work order so the foreman knows the universe approved the fit. By the time the moon shoulders over the horizon, your skin has cooled and your breathing has set itself to a slower meter. The pyramid looks less like a project and more like a companion that happens to be triangular. You brush sand from your hair, fail, and accept that you will be emptying a small desert from your blanket for the rest of your career. That's all right. You've slept on worse. Remember the inn where the mattress introduced you to its entire extended family of springs? You rise not because the night has ended, but because sleep has found where you left your body. On the walk back, your shadow moves beside you like a patient friend, growing softer as the coals fade. At your tent flap, you pause and look back one last time. The deacons climb, Orion tilts, Sirius bides its moment. The dunes hold their breath. The sky's busy, but its busyness is the quiet kind, the sort that lets you set your burdens down without making a speech about it. You slip inside, lower yourself to the mat, and pull the linen over your chest. The sand still clings to your ankles. The night still hums with far-off life. Your eyelids still carry a thread of coal, proof that beauty and practicality sometimes shake hands. You breathe once, twice, a third time, longer out than in. Under the Pharaoh's sky, with stars practicing the old art of patience, you sleep the slow sleep of a stone, learning how to be a mountain. Morning returns without asking your opinion, nudging you awake with a breeze that smells faintly of damp linen and the sour tang of river mud. You leave the quiet of the desert behind and step into a different kind of silence, the hollow, watchful air of a medieval town where something is wrong. The streets are emptier than they should be, the usual chatter and clatter replaced by a muted shuffle of footsteps. A man passes you, his face pale under the shadow of his hood. He doesn't make eye contact. Behind him, a woman coughs into the crook of her arm and hurries inside, pulling the door shut. The smell hits you next. Not the sharp tang of fish or the comforting smoke of bread ovens, but something sweet and rotten, a smell that clings in your throat. You hear it whispered first at the baker's stall. Saint Anthony's fire. The name sounds almost gentle, like something a kindly old monk might bless you with, but the reality is far crueler. A mainstream fact comes forward. This illness, also called ergotism, was caused by eating rye grain contaminated with a fungus. It could bring burning pain in the limbs, hallucinations, convulsions, even gangrene. In some years, whole villages suffered, the bread itself turning traitor. The baker swears his rye is clean, pounding his fist on the counter for emphasis. You're tempted to believe him, but a loaf on the shelf looks darker than usual, its crust mottled. A fringe tidbit seeps in. In some regions, ergot poisoning outbreaks may have fueled witchcraft accusations, strange visions, fits, and bewitchments, all too easily blamed on a neighbour instead of a contaminated harvest. You move on, but the unease follows you. At the edge of the square, a group gathers around a young man seated on the ground, his leg bandaged hastily with a strip of wool. His eyes are glassy, his hands twitch. An older woman sprinkles holy water over him, muttering prayers under her breath. Historians still argue whether the church's rituals in these moments were acts of genuine care, desperate gestures without medical effect, or a little of both. Watching her, you suspect the distinction matters less to the boy than the touch of her hand on his shoulder. Further down the lane, a merchant hawks garlic and rosemary, claiming they chase the sickness from the air. You buy a sprig not because you believe him, but because the sharp green scent cuts through the cloying heaviness in your nostrils. Joke one stirs. At least if you do fall ill, no vampire will dare get within a mile. The apothecary's shop is dim, its shelves crowded with jars. Some hold dried herbs, others powders of unknown origin, all labelled in a crabbed script that might as well be a secret code. The apothecary himself, a narrow man with an ink-stained cuff, eyes you like he's trying to match your face to an ailment. He offers a vial of something that smells faintly of vinegar and mint, assuring you it's good for the humours. You wonder which humours, and whether they'd appreciate the gesture. Outside, the sky has gone grey, though you're not sure if it's from clouds or the haze of smoke curling from so many chimneys. The air feels thicker now, pressed down by the awareness of sickness weaving through the lanes. Yet life continues. Two boys run past chasing a hoop. A washerwoman laughs as she wrings out a tunic. A dog barks indignantly at a crow. Survival here is rarely a matter of uninterrupted health. You pass a church where candles flicker against the dark stone, their light spilling onto the worn threshold. Inside, the pews are dotted with villagers, some praying, some simply sitting, eyes closed, as if resting in the only public space where it's acceptable to stop moving. The smell of beeswax and incense is strong enough to push back the outside air for a little while. You stay just long enough for the heaviness in your chest to loosen. When you step back out, the day has leaned toward afternoon. A cart rattles by, carrying bundles of straw, perhaps to replace bedding in homes where sickness has touched. You walk in the opposite direction, following the sharp ascent of wood smoke toward the riverbank. Here, away from the clustered houses, the air feels cleaner. You sit on a worn stone and watch the water slide past, carrying sunlight and shadows in equal measure. You know the sickness won't vanish with a change of scenery, but for a few minutes, the river's endless movement makes it feel as though time is still wide enough to hold something better. Joke 2 wanders in lazily. You tell yourself the river's current is the medieval version of a refresh button, pulling down to reload the day with slightly fewer problems. You breathe deeply, the rosemary sprig still sharp in your palm, and let the sound of water replace the coughs and whispers for as long as it can. A bell tolls in the distance, slow, deliberate. You know it might mark vespers or another passing. Either way, you rise and start back toward the village. The shadows are longer now, the lanes quieter, but somewhere in the hush you catch the smell of bread baking again. Ordinary bread, without menace. And for a moment, you let yourself believe in the possibility of a clean loaf. By morning the air has shifted, not fresher but busier, as though the entire town woke up with the same mission, to chase sickness out the door with whatever they can throw at it. You follow the murmur toward the apothecary's lane, drawn by a smell equal parts earthy, sharp, and vaguely alarming. Inside the shop, the shelves are now even more crowded, as if they multiplied overnight. Glass bottles gleam amber in the dim light. Ceramic jars squat like suspicious toads. Bundles of dried plants hang from the rafters, their shadows twitching in the draught. The apothecary, sleeves rolled and hair in wild compliance with gravity, moves between the workbench and a small brazier where something dark bubbles in an iron pot. A mainstream fact unfurls. Medieval medicine was an intricate mix of herbal knowledge, spiritual belief, and trial and error remedies, many of which could either heal or harm depending on preparation. You watch as he pinches powdered root into the pot, followed by a swirl of red wine that hisses as it meets the heat. The smell blooms, sweet, bitter, and faintly metallic. He sets the pot aside and pulls down a jar of preserved leeches, their long bodies coiled like punctuation marks in cloudy water. For balancing the humours, he says without irony. You glance away, deciding quickly that your humours are fine as they are. In the corner, a mortar and pestle wait beside a bowl of dried poppy heads, the seeds rattling softly as he works. A fringe tidbit drifts in. Some remedies included ingredients you'd never volunteer for: ground emeralds, powdered mummy, even unicorn horn, likely narwhal tusk, all fetched at a price high enough to make you feel better or worse instantly, depending on your purse. A woman bursts in, clutching her arm where a rash blooms angry red. The apothecary barely glances before handing her a jar of greenish paste. He tells her to keep it cool, out of the sun, and to avoid bad air, which you take to mean the street outside. Historians still argue whether such instructions were based on genuine medical reasoning or the practical wisdom of stay home and rest, dressed up in herbal Latin. You edge toward the shelves, scanning for something that might be both useful and non-lethal. A bottle labelled Aqua Mirabilis catches your eye. The apothecary explains it's a distillation of herbs and spices in alcohol for heart and head, which sounds vague enough to be safe. You buy a small flask, the coin warm from your hand as it changes owners. Joke one perks up. You tell yourself you're now in possession of either a miraculous cure or the medieval equivalent of fancy gin. Either way, you win. Outside, you find a knot of people gathered around a travelling seller whose cart overflows with remedies less regulated. He grins widely, holding up a pouch and swearing it contains the dried tongue of a snake that once guarded a pharaoh's tomb. Keeps fevers away, he says, though, judging by his wink, it might also keep friends away. He offers a bottle of rose water, blessed by 7 saints, and something in a stoppered gourd he calls dragon's breath. You don't ask. The crowd thins and you drift toward the church square, where a small table has been set up by the infirmary. A nun with gentle eyes and forearms, like a blacksmith's doles, out cups of herbal infusion. The steam smells of chamomile and mint, with something spicier beneath. She explains it soothes coughs and settles the stomach, and you notice her instructions are clear, simple, and easy to remember. Perhaps that's part of the cure. A man nearby coughs until his face flushes, then sips his cup and sits with his back against the wall. No one moves away. In a week, maybe they will, but for now, proximity still outweighs fear. Joke 2 shuffles in. You think if this town survives on anything, it's stubbornness and tea. You sip your own cup, the warmth seeping into your hands before it ever reaches your throat. The blend is comforting, bitter at first, then soft, with the mint cooling your tongue as you swallow. You imagine this same recipe handed down through generations, each healer adding a leaf or pinch until it became the one thing they trusted on a bad day. By mid-afternoon, the streets smell faintly better, not because the sickness is gone, but because rosemary, lavender, and smoke from incense braziers have muscled into the air. You pass doorways where bunches of herbs are pinned to the lintel, a hopeful green fringe against the dark wood. Somewhere a bell rings, and you remember the flask in your pocket, its faint herbal scent mingling with the steam still clinging to your sleeve. Historians still argue how much of medieval medicine worked in the way we think of today, but watching the measured movements of the nun, the careful mixing of the apothecary, and even the boisterous charm of the travelling seller, you realise something. Belief is its own ingredient, and in the right dose, it just might help. As you turn toward home, the breeze shifts, and you catch a whisper of the river's clean scent. Between that and the faint bite of mint in your mouth, the air feels almost new. Joke 3 drifts by as you walk. Maybe your humours weren't unbalanced after all, just thirsty. The road out of town tilts uphill, muddy from yesterday's rain, and your boots make that low, reluctant schlock with every step. You're on your way to the manor again, but not for bread, not for herbs. This time, it's for something far more delicate. Poetry. At least that's what you were told. By the time you pass under the carved stone arch into the courtyard, you can already hear a lute string being tuned and retuned, its pitch climbing, like a nervous swallow. Inside the great hall, the air is warm from the hearth, perfumed faintly with rose water. A man in fine wool leans against the table, reciting something about a lady's sunlit gaze to a group of politely smiling women. The verses are heavy on the metaphor and light on reality, which is fitting, because from the look of his boots, he came in from the same muddy lane as you. Joke 1 grins. You're pretty sure muddy boots isn't in the romantic ideal, unless it's a very niche ballad. A mainstream fact settles in. The tradition of courtly love in the medieval period wove elaborate codes of chivalry, devotion, and unattainable romance, often more about display and social manoeuvring than genuine relationships. Knights and nobles composed poems, commissioned songs, and exchanged favours like ribbons or gloves as tokens of admiration. Whether they believed every word or just enjoyed the performance is another question entirely. You drift to the edge of the gathering, where a servant is refilling cups with spiced wine. It's fragrant with cinnamon and cloves, and you accept one, letting the warmth slip into your fingers. The minstrel strums a gentler tune now, singing of a shepherdess whose love is purer than a winter rose. You glance toward the door, where the actual winter roses, mud-splashed and limp, cling to the garden wall. Historians still argue whether these poetic exchanges were harmless entertainment, subtle political tools, or a sanctioned way to navigate the tight constraints of noble marriages. Watching a lady pass a folded scrap of parchment to the poet, you suspect it's all three. At the high table, a noblewoman reclines, her gown a deep green that catches the firelight. Her sleeves are embroidered with golden thread, but when she shifts her skirt, you spot the edge of her shoe, dusty, the leather cracked. It's a reminder that even in all this softness, the mud waits just beyond the door. The poet finishes with a bow, and the audience disperses into smaller knots of conversation. You wander toward the hearth, where two squires are quietly arguing about whether the lady in question actually prefers hawking to verse. One claims she once skipped a feast entirely to mend her own falcon's jesses. You imagine that scene. Silk swapped for leather, poetry traded for the snap of wings. Joke 2 sidles in. Maybe the best love poem in this hall was written in falcon scratches. A servant passes with a tray of almond pastries, their tops dusted with sugar so fine it looks like frost. You take one and bite. It's crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, the sweetness tempered by the nut's richness. Across the hall, the minstrel begins another song, this one brisker, about a knight who mistook a miller's wife for a princess in disguise. The crowd laughs at the refrain. You suspect the miller's wife enjoyed the mistake. A fringe tidbit comes to mind. Some troubadours were women, trobairites, who composed and performed their own songs, often with sharper wit and less patience for the idealised nonsense of their male counterparts. You wonder how one of them might rewrite the shepherdess ballad you heard earlier, perhaps swapping the rose for a mud-proof cloak. The noblewoman in green rises and crosses the hall, her skirts swaying like a tide. She stops beside you, glancing once at your boots, before asking, with a half-smile, whether you write verse. You confess you don't, but that you've been known to remember a line or two. She nods, as if that's enough. Then remember this one, she says, quoting a line about love thriving even where the ground is poor. You file it away, not sure if she means the metaphor or your actual muddy boots. As the evening leans toward dusk, the hall fills with softer talk. Servants lay fresh rushes underfoot, herbs crushed beneath boots to scent the air. The hearth spits a final shower of sparks, and the minstrel plucks one last, lingering chord. You take a final sip of your wine and realise that, for all the grand words and silken sleeves, the charm of this evening rests on something simpler. The way people here, muddy or not, find small ways to make each other feel noticed. Joke 3 walks you to the door. Maybe your true calling isn't poetry, but being the kind of audience whose boots are muddy enough to make the verses seem authentic. Outside, the courtyard stones are slick, the air damp with the promise of more rain. You pull your cloak tighter and head back down the lane, the poet's last rhymes tangling with the sound of your footsteps in the mud. Steam curls up like a soft hand, brushing your face the moment you push open the heavy wooden door. The scent, warm, mineral and faintly floral, wraps itself around you before you've even stepped inside. You've traded the mud and draughts of the medieval manor for something altogether different. The public baths of ancient Rome, where the water speaks in low, soothing splashes and conversation hums just beneath the surface. The floor is smooth stone, polished by thousands of bare feet, mosaics spread out in coloured tesserae, fish leaping among curling waves, dolphins chasing each other in a loop that never ends. Light filters through high windows, breaking into soft rectangles that lie across the benches like sleeping cats. A mainstream fact eases in. Roman baths weren't just for washing. They were the social heart of the city, a place to meet friends, strike business deals, hear gossip, and relax. The complex could include a frigidarium for cold plunges, a tepidarium for warm lounging, and a coldarium for heat that sinks into your bones. Some even had exercise yards, libraries, and food stalls, because why leave if you didn't have to? You move through the tepidarium first. The air is moist and heavy, with the scent of olive oil. Men seated along the benches rub it into their skin before scraping it off with curved metal strigils, carrying away dirt and sweat. One man gestures for you to sit, offering a small flask. The oil feels thick and cool in your palm, glistening as you smooth it across your arms. A slave passes with a brass strigil and deftly scrapes your skin, leaving it tingling and oddly refreshed. Joke 1 arrives. You can't help but think this is the Roman version of a spa day, only with more toga storage space. Beyond, the caldarium beckons. You step through the arch, and heat rushes at you like a playful shove. The steam is thick here, the pool at its centre rippling gently from the movements of bathers who sit shoulder deep, their voices softened by the haze. A fringe tidbit bubbles up. Roman heating systems, hypercourse, piped hot air beneath the floors and through hollow walls, turning these rooms into ancient saunas long before anyone thought to plug something into a wall socket. You sink into the water, the heat wrapping around you like a weighted cloak. Across the pool, 2 men speak in low tones, their heads inclined toward each other. You catch fragments, grain shipments, a magistrate's decision, something about an upcoming chariot race. Historians still argue whether these bathhouse conversations were as politically important as some sources suggest, or if chroniclers simply liked the idea of emperors and merchants alike, making history while half submerged in hot water. After a while, you step out, water running in rivulets down your arms, and wander toward the frigidarium. The cold plunge pool gleams like a slice of captured sky. You brace yourself and lower in. The chill bites, instantly clearing the warm fog from your mind. A boy dives in beside you, surfacing with a grin before sprinting for the towels. Around the edge of the pool, an old man tells a story to anyone who will listen, about a general who once bathed here before marching to victory, returning weeks later to the same pool, richer in coin and poorer in teeth. The listeners laugh, and the story folds into the sound of water lapping against stone. You dry off with a length of linen, then follow your nose to a small stall selling snacks. Bowls of olives glisten in oil, and trays of honey cakes promise a sweetness that clings to your fingers. You choose the cakes, biting into their crisp edges, while warm honey pools in the centre. Joke two sighs happily. You decide every meeting, political or otherwise, would go better if it ended with these. On your way out, you pass through the palestra, the exercise yard. A few men practice wrestling, their limbs sliding and locking with the same grace you saw in the water. Others toss a heavy ball back and forth, their shouts echoing off the walls. One man wipes sweat from his brow, then heads straight for the baths again, his routine as steady as the tide. The afternoon light has shifted by the time you step back into the street. The cool air outside feels almost too sharp after the steam's embrace, but your skin is warm and supple, your limbs loose. In the distance, the noise of the forum rises, vendors calling, carts creaking, but for a few lingering moments, you carry the baths with you, a pocket of heat and quiet in a world that rarely offers either. Joke 3 walks beside you. You think you could handle medieval mud just fine if someone built one of these in the village square. You leave the steam and civility of the baths and follow the river of voices toward a roar that sounds like weather learning to talk. The Colosseum rises ahead, a ring of pale stone bitten out of the sky, its arches stacked like jawlines. You slip into the flow at one of the numbered entrances, clutching your little tessera ticket like a breadcrumb back to yourself. Officials shepherd you to your place, class and order mapped into steps and seats, so nobody forgets who sits where. A mainstream detail clicks into place. Seating is strictly stratified, senators down close, equestrians next, citizens above that, women and the poor highest of all. And when it's full, this place swallows more than 50,000 heartbeats at once. The first surprise is shade. Sailors on duty have rigged the velarium, a canvas canopy that billows like a tame cloud across the top, snipping off the harshest sun. You find your spot with a sliver of shade and a decent angle to the arena. Below, the sand is raked neat, as if the ground has already decided to be a stage, not a floor. Vendors spiral through the aisles with practiced agility, their baskets knocking gently against knees. The choices are familiar, and not. Olives brined sharp enough to wake the shyest tongue, dates glossy as oiled wood, hunks of bread, and yes, sausages of mysterious ancestry. You pick olives and bread, and promise the sausage you'll revisit your decision when bravery grows legs. Joke 1 strolls by. You tell yourself the sausage is historically authentic, which unfortunately does not guarantee emotionally reassuring. A brass horn blares and the crowd answers in a tidal cheer. Below, pairs of youths jog into the sunlight with wooden swords, saluting the grandstand. It's the morning programme. Mock bouts, displays of athletic form, a rehearsal for bravery. You settle into the rhythm. The rattle of armour, the scrape of sandals, the small civic pride of seeing everything run on time. The olive seller returns and upsells you on a twist of herbs to sprinkle over the brine. Something minty that reminds you faintly of the pomanders, an orange blossom that softened a smoky hall far from here. For a moment the world is one continuous pantry with better architecture. You watch the arena crew at work, silent, precise, dragging the rake in long, tidy lines that reset the day. A fringe tidbit slips in with the dust. The word arena comes from harina, the sand that soaks up whatever the spectacle spills. You focus on the rake's neat pattern and let the abstraction carry the rest. Midday warms the stone, and the venaciones, the beast shows, begin. Trumpets, gates, a rush of animal motion shaped by trainers whose hands move faster than eyes can track. No gore here. What you catch are flashes, a leopard's taut shoulder, a handler's red tassel, the glitter of a net arcing like a thrown constellation. You hear the crowd's collective inhale, feel your own ribs copy, it, then, the exhale, as the sequence ends in a controlled whirl. Historians still argue whether the logistics of these spectacles were as massive as later authors bragged, thousands of animals in a single festival, or whether numbers swelled in retelling like fish stories. What you feel in this minute is scale enough. The effort, the theatre, the practiced choreography that keeps awe ahead of fear. A runner with a tray of cups stops at your row, sloshing cool, watered wine. You trade a coin and take a sip, the sourness cleaning the salt from your tongue. The man behind you crunches a honeyed nut and offers the bag across your shoulder. You take one and immediately regret not taking two. Joke 2 pats your shoulder. Generosity is a virtue. Learning to accept more generosity is a skill. Between sets, a poet in a short cloak calls out lines praising the editor, the sponsor whose money makes today possible. The verses bounce around like polite pebbles. You chew bread, let the syllables drift by, and think of the troubadour's tidy couplets in a cold manner. Different empire, same need. A flattering chorus keeps the civic machine greased. Now the afternoon programme, gladiators. The trumpet's voice changes, richer, ceremonial, and the rumble that answers feels deeper, as if the stone itself is learning to purr. Pairs are announced, their styles called like recipes. Mermisho with big shield and fish-crested helm. Thraex with curved blade. Retiarius with net and trident, all tied and timing. They salute the high seats with practiced formality. No universal, hail we who are about to die here. You hear only targeted shouts and the workmanlike clack of gear. A mainstream note tucks in. Many of these men are trained professionals with contracts, diets, and medical care that ironically surpass what many labourers outside receive. Fame is fickle but real. Wages rise and fall like swallows. They fight in bursts, footwork, distance, a feint that turns the crowd into a single throat. You count heartbeats in the pauses and feel your own pulse copying the match like a schoolboy tracing letters. When a bout ends decisively, the victor stands wide-chested, and the arena crew hustles out again, raking clean lines as if resetting a slate. Someone nearby mutters about thumbs up or down, and the row becomes a debate club. Historians still argue whether the famous gesture meant what modern tales insist, whether thumb turned indicated mercy or death, or whether the real signals were cloths waved by officials, while the crowd merely sang its preference. You decide hand signs are safest when ordering street food. The sausage vendor returns with a grin that deserves its own triumphal arch. You cave, buying one wrapped in bread and baptize it with a splash of garum from a little clay bottle the vendor carries like a relic. The fish sauce's tang rides the fat just right, and you nod surprised. He thumps his chest as if he cooked. Rome itself. Joke 3 bows. You admit privately that this is the second best thing you've eaten today, and the first is still the idea of eating a second. A cool breath moves through the upper tiers. You glance up and see a spray of water mist the air, a scented whisper that might be saffron or just your memory showing off after the baths. Either way, the dust settles. A child behind you, face striped with grape juice, leans forward to tell you which gladiator is fastest in the turns. You ask if he means like a racer, and he nods solemnly as if speed belongs to everything that circles Rome. The sun tacks lower, the velarium catches a golden edge. One last pair enters, matched in height but not in mood. One bounces, one watches. Their bout is a chessboard of small decisions. Shield, step, breath, angle, a tap tapping toward an ending you never quite see until it's there. When the missiles of laurel and lords finish falling, the noise resolves into conversation again, the way a river separates into streams at a delta. People begin to stand, smoothing tunics, shaking crumbs from laps, pocketing lucky olive pits like talismans. On your way to the stair, you pass a square of shadow where an artist sketches on a wax tablet, quick lines capturing helmets and stance. He will later copy them onto something more permanent, and somewhere in a future we won't see, a scholar will stare at those lines and argue about what the crowd demanded and what the editor allowed. You touch the stone as you pass, cool now, where it was warm hours ago, and file away the feeling that architecture can hold the echo of voices the way a shell holds sea noise. Outside, the late light pours like honey along the paving. The city surges again. Carts creak, fountains chatter. A baker drags a peel from the oven. You taste the last salt of the olives on your thumb and the ghost of garum on the air, and realise the day has taught you the Colosseum's quiet secret. For all its thunder, it is a machine for manufacturing afternoons. Measured, staged, then gently handed back to you with tired legs, a sticky jaw, and stories that walk themselves home. You fall into the street's current, the valerium shrinking behind you into a pale petal folded away. Tomorrow will be markets, messengers, maybe honey cakes if fortune is feeling musical. For now, you carry the arena's chalky dust in the seams of your sandals, and the city's noise like a warm, familiar cloak. Cold arrives the way a rumour does. Everybody feels it before anybody admits it. You wake to a stillness so crisp it could chime, the kind of quiet that makes your breath sound like it's interrupting. Your blanket is a negotiator, your straw mattress a conspiracy of storks that remember summer only, in theory. When you lift the shutter, the world has turned to pewter, roof lines etched with hoarfrost, the lanes scabbed over with ice, the well bucket sealed like a stubborn secret. Frost creeps under the door as if the floorboards were an invitation, then climbs your toes with the slow confidence of a cat claiming a lap. Layer 1 is a shirt that could stand up by itself from yesterday's smoke. Layer 2 is a wool tunic, the one with elbows that are more patched than original story. Layer 3 is your cloak, which you pretend is grander than it is by arranging it with theatrical dignity. You tie a scarf, pull on mitts, and still the air nips your nose, like it's tasting before biting. Joke one rallies, you tell yourself, this is crisp, refreshing weather. The way people call salt cod flavourful when they mean chewing with homework. You crouch at the hearth, teasing yesterday's ash into a reluctant glow. Sparks bloom like tiny promises, and you feed them kindling until flame finally takes. A patient orange that licks the iron pot and works up the nerve to be heat. A mainstream fact warms your thoughts. For most people, the household fire is the house. Cooking, light and life in one circle, with smoke venting through a louvre or high opening because chimneys aren't common here yet. The roof timbers sweat a little as the frost above them shrugs. Breakfast is ambition more than menu. Yesterday's bread, sliced and toasted on a stick, becomes not quite new bread if you hold it near enough to smoke to make your eyes complain. You rub a clove of garlic over it because the herb seller swore it keeps winter out of the bones, and if it doesn't, at least it keeps the neighbours out of conversational range. You sip weak ale that remembers being bubbles and gauge how far the day's warmth will stretch. The fire must survive your errands, and so must you. Outside, the lane crackles underfoot. Chickens hop indignantly from one cold patch to another, like connoisseurs of discomforts. The pig snorts steam rings, snuffling straw with the purposeful air of someone who understands breakfast as a vocation. You hack the well's surface with a stick. The ice fractures into crystalline islands, then yields a dark circle of water that smells of iron and last autumn's leaves. Your fingers burn with that special fire that only very cold things invent. Historians still argue whether the so-called Little Ice Age truly begins in the late 1200s or sharpens later, but you don't need a manuscript to tell you this winter is meaner than the last. Wind sneaks through chinks in the walls and drafts under the door, mapping your cottage like a cartographer of discomfort. You stuff moss and rags into the worst gaps, Pin sprigs of rosemary and thyme to the lintel for cheer. Your festival badge from Section 8, getting a second career as interior design. When you pace, the herbs bruise and release that green, clean smell that says we remember summer for you. Neighbours compare strategies over the fence with the grave intensity of generals. One swears by hot stones, wrapped in cloth to pre-warm a bed. Another swears louder by a pot filled with embers tucked under a stool. A third swears quietly because he scorched the stool last year. A fringe tidbit slips in. Some households hang small leather ear caps from hat brims for children, not out of fashion but survival. Ears are negotiable only if you'd like fewer of them come spring. You tuck your own hat lower and pretend you look dashing, rather than bundled by committee. The church bell carries far in thin air, its sound clean as a blade. At mass, breath steams like incense from every mouth, and the stone floor sucks heat from boots as if it's paid commission. Candles gutter, wax stiffening in pleats, and the priest's voice rises and falls with a cadence that feels like a blanket, even if the temperature disagrees. A woman beside you mutters that St. Wenceslas knows about winter and may be taking notes. You nod because negotiating with saints is as traditional as complaining about the price of firewood. On the way back, you pass the mill stream wearing a hard skin. Boys test the edge with sticks. Someone tosses a pebble and flinches as if the ice could scold. Farther on, a cart lurches through ruts gone iron hard, the driver coaxing the wheels with the kind of language that would alarm a bishop and delight a blacksmith. You spot the reeve counting firewood stacks against promised tallies. Winter turns fairness into arithmetic, and arithmetic into argument. Indoors again, you hang your damp mitts on a peg, knead a small dough with hands that protest, and set it near the hearth to rise. It will not. It will merely reconsider. Meanwhile, you cut turnips into honest cubes, add a heel of salted pork, and remind the pot that patience is a spice. The room smells better by the minute, a stew of onion, smoke, and the kind of hope you can eat with a spoon. Joke 2 sidles over the rim. You declare this your winter cuisine, also known as everything that survived the cellar plus optimism. Evening squeezes in early, like a guest who arrives before the crumbs are swept. You string a rushlight, its tallow smoke adding its own opinion to the room's air, and settle to mend a seam with numb fingers. The fire pops a bright coal that leaps like a wayward flea, and you stamp it out before it auditions your floor as kindling. You remember the noble hall's fresh herbs, thank you, rushes as a service, and decide to copy the trick. A pinch of lavender into the rushes, a pinch of thyme, a pinch of the memory of warmth. The bed beckons because the bed is the only place that isn't a negotiation. You heft the warming stone, hot from the hearth, wrapped tight, drag it under the blanket's foot, and slide in with a hiss that begins as complaint and ends as relief. The straw mattress rustles, the wool scratches, the blanket presses like a friendly dog. Outside, frost needles the window's rim with loops and ferns, nature doodling on your glassless shutters' gaps. Mainstream reality checks in again. Glazing is rare and precious in most homes. Shutters and oiled linen take the draft's sharpest tooth, but winter still finds the rest. You listen. A fox bark, the slow timber creak, your own breath evening out. Somewhere a neighbour coughs twice. The whole row knows who by the rhythm, and then a door thumps, then quiet. Historians still argue whether night curfews and cover fires, couvre-feu, were strictly enforced rules or more like communal habits, but either way, flames sink low and embers learn to be discreet. You roll to your side and inventory the day like a ledger you mean to balance. Water broken, fire kept, stew earned, seam mended, toes accounted for. Your amulet of Horus rests cold against your chest, Egypt's bright sky reduced to a coin of metal beneath a wool mountain, and you smile at the thought of coal refusing to smudge even in this dry air. The world is smaller now, but small is fine when small is warm. Before sleep, you stage one last defence: cloak over blanket, spare tunic as a scarf, mitts under the pillow so they greet you warm in the morning. You tuck the rosemary sprig near your cheek as if perfume could be a climate. Joke 3 yawns. You consider writing a love poem to your bed warmer and decide the relationship is serious enough to keep private. The wind lifts, fingers the eaves, and moves on. Your fire squints, then drowses. In the dark, you feel the slow glow at the foot of the bed, travelling toward your knees, like sunrise with an appointment. Tomorrow we'll ask the same questions: ice, wood, water, work, and you will answer them with the same stubborn rituals. Blow, bank, stitch, stir, step, step, step. Misery has a way of looking grand on a wall map, but here it's just 1,000 tiny discomforts negotiated into something livable. You close your eyes. Frost continues its careful handwriting under the door. The stew thickens by memory. The rushlight gutters into a thread of shadow. And winter, imprecise, inconvenient, undeniable, lays down beside you like a cold dog that eventually learns to share the blanket. The first thing you notice is the smell. Not the usual stew and smoke perfume of a medieval village, but something sharper, sun-warmed and metallic, like rain on hot stone. You're not in the cold lane anymore. You're under a sky so dry it seems to have been polished, walking along a broad, straight road that glitters with crushed quartz. On either side, the desert stretches out in low, lazy ripples until it hits the horizon, where the air itself blurs like brushed glass. Ahead, shapes rise. Impossible at first, then undeniable. Massive triangles that seem to lean against the sky, their edges knife-sharp in the sunlight. You're walking toward the pyramids of Giza. Even here, before you reach the first base stone, the scale knocks language out of your head. Your shadow, once casual, now looks small and lost. The heat gathers in the stones underfoot. You squint at the white limestone casing stones near the pyramid's base, smooth as poured milk and fitted so tightly you could pretend they were carved by a giant with obsessive tendencies. Mainstream fact: the Great Pyramid of Khufu was built around 4,500 years ago and originally stood over 146 metres tall, its smooth casing reflecting the sun so brilliantly it may have been visible from miles away, a beacon to anyone crossing the Nile plain. You approach the workers' village first, because these feats didn't spring from nowhere. The air smells of bread baking in clay ovens, the yeasty warmth curling out to meet the sun's heat like two old friends. Here are rows of modest mud brick houses, storage yards, and communal bakeries turning out flat loaves for hundreds. Someone waves you over to taste. A soft disc fresh from the oven, brushed with oil and sprinkled with herbs you can't quite name. Joke 1 rises. You think the bread is so good you'd move rocks for it, which might be the ancient Egyptian HR policy in a nutshell. Nearby, a stonecutter works in the shade, copper chisel ringing against granite. Chips gather at his feet like a second desert. You run your fingers over a half-shaped block, its surface both gritty and warm, and imagine the hundreds of hands that will touch it before it reaches the pyramid's flank. A fringe tidbit clings here. Despite the grand myths, evidence suggests the pyramid workers were skilled labourers who rotated in and out, fed, housed, and given medical care, rather than endless lines of starving slaves. You follow a ramp up to the pyramid's side. Up close, each block is nearly as tall as you, and they march upward in steady layers, a stone staircase to the sun. The wind shifts and brings with it the faint smell of the Nile, even though the river lies some distance away. A reminder that water was as vital to the building as stone for transporting the blocks on barges when the floodwaters were high. Historians still argue whether the massive ramps used for construction ran straight, zigzagged, or spiraled inside the structure, a logistical riddle buried as deep as any tomb. At the base, a group of men maneuver a block using wooden sledges and wet sand to reduce friction. You watch their feet shuffle in time, the shout of the overseer carrying over the rhythmic groan of wood against stone. The block slides forward, and the team exhales as one. You join in, though your contribution is mostly moral support and not muscle. You climb a few courses, your sandals scuffing pale dust, until the view tilts. The workers' village shrinks to a scattering of dots, the desert's waves fade to beige mist, and Cairo's future skyline hovers faint and far. On the horizon, the Sphinx crouches, its gaze locked on the rising sun's daily drama. The heat is steady now, pressing against your shoulders. You retreat into the shadow of a nearby mastaba tomb, cooler, smelling faintly of resin and dust. Relief blooms in your skin, like water poured over dry roots. In the dim, painted figures walk along the walls, men harvesting grain, women pouring wine, cattle stepping through shallow water. The colours, deep red, ochre, lapis blue, still breathe after millennia, as if the painters just stepped out for lunch. A man in a linen kilt offers you a sip from a jar of beer, thick and sweet, more porridge than drink. You take it politely, the yeast and grain clinging to your tongue like an edible handshake. Outside, the sound of chisels returns, the heartbeat of this stone world. Joke, too, leans in. You realise that with the bread, the beer, and the dry heat, you could almost mistake this for a strange outdoor cafe, one where the renovations have been ongoing for 4,000 years. By late afternoon, the light tilts golden. The pyramid's shadow stretches across the desert like a sundial too proud to be wrong. You watch as teams finish their shifts, tools laid in neat rows, baskets stacked, a small army retreating in good order. The overseer counts each crew, his voice carrying a practiced edge. Somewhere, a pot of lentils bubbles for the evening meal. You take a slow walk toward the Sphinx, its lion body and human face carved from a single mass of limestone. The nose is famously missing, though historians still argue whether it was lost to weather, deliberate damage, or a bad day with ancient maintenance. Its expression is complicated, calm, faintly amused, maybe even resigned to the long watch. Sand curls at its paws, whispering the kind of stories that keep archaeologists awake. The desert cools quickly once the sun dips. You pull your cloak tight and glance back one last time at the pyramids, now blushed in rose light. They seem less like buildings and more like frozen waves in a stone ocean, each block a drop of human intent. Mainstream fact closes the day. For nearly 4,000 years, the Great Pyramid was the tallest man-made structure in the world, until a cathedral spire in Lincoln, England, finally surpassed it. Joke 3 trails behind you like a long shadow. You think if the medieval villagers could see this, they'd complain about the walk, but immediately start measuring for sheep storage inside. The stars come quickly here, hard and bright. Somewhere, a breeze lifts from the Nile, carrying the faint smell of reeds and silt. You head toward it, the desert crunching underfoot, your thoughts stacking themselves in quiet layers, like the stones you're leaving behind. The Nile at night is not black, it's liquid silver, moving slow enough to pretend it's standing still. You follow the faint gleam to a cluster of moored boats, their sails furled like folded wings, their hulls creaking as they nudge each other. The air is cool now, carrying scents you've only brushed against before. Reeds, damp wood, and a tang of fish so fresh it hasn't decided whether it wants to be dinner. A ferryman in a white linen tunic waves you aboard without ceremony, his bare feet gripping the deck like he grew here. His boat is long, narrow, with a single mast, and a deck just wide enough for a few jars, bundles, and people who are willing to be temporary furniture. You settle on a rolled mat while he readies the sail, the sound of rope against wood, as steady as a heartbeat. Mainstream fact drifts in. Riverboats were the arteries of ancient Egypt, carrying grain, stone, and people between the delta and the far south. Their design tuned to the Nile's twin personalities, northbound current, southbound wind, As the boat eases away from shore, you feel the current tug beneath you, sly but constant. The ferryman catches the south wind, the sail bellies, and the deck tilts just enough to make you brace with your toes. You pass other boats, some heavy with quarried stone, others stacked with baskets of onions, dates, and dried fish. Voices carry easily over water. Greetings are exchanged like small coins. Joke one strolls by in the moonlight. You realise you're basically on an ancient commuter ferry, except the rush hour here smells like cumin and river mud instead of damp wool coats and questionable coffee. Along the banks the night work continues. Farmers lead donkeys loaded with cut papyrus toward low sheds, the stalks bound in tight green bundles. Women wash linen in the shallows, slapping the cloth against smooth stones, their laughter carrying over the steady splash. Fires glow in fishing camps, sparks leaping into the breeze before winking out over the water. The ferryman points upriver to a faint cluster of lights. Your destination. It's a temple complex, one of the great ones, but first you'll pass the fields that feed it. The smell changes as you near the floodplain. Rich silt, damp earth, and a trace of something sweet from flowering lotus in irrigation ponds. A fringe tidbit slips in. Some ancient Egyptian farmers used hippos as living lawnmowers for overgrown reeds. Though manageable, was not a quality hippos were famous for, then or now. The moon hangs low, reflected in long stripes on the water. The ferryman hums a tune with more rhythm than melody, a working song that matches the creak of the mast. You find yourself humming too, the cool air in your lungs like clean cloth against your skin. You dock at a narrow jetty, where palm trunks serve as pilings. The temple looms beyond the dark fields, its pylons rising like giant gates, each side sloped and carved with figures that seem to move in the flicker of torchlight. A line of priests in white carry offerings, bread, beer, figs, jars of honey, balanced with the ease of habit. Mainstream fact folds in. Major temples here were not only religious centres, but also economic powerhouses, controlling farmland, granaries, workshops, and fleets of boats. You're drawn to the sound of water again. This time, not the river's flow, but the gush of a stone channel within the temple walls. You follow it into a courtyard, where a rectangular pool glints under the moon. The air is warmer here, scented with lotus and incense from braziers. A priest gestures to the pool, explaining through signs and slow words that it is for ritual cleansing before entering the sanctuary. You kneel and cup your hands, the water cool and faintly sweet. Inside, the temple swallows sound. Columns rise like bundled papyrus stalks, their tops blooming into carved capitals, painted in colours that survive the centuries as if stubbornness were a pigment. Torches cast slow shadows over reliefs of gods and pharaohs, exchanging gifts, smiting enemies, or ploughing fields. Myth and life braided together without visible seam. Historians still argue whether certain temple scenes are literal records of events or purely symbolic, their meaning intended for the gods rather than human archives. The heady mix of scents, resin, honeyed wine, and burning cedar makes your eyes water in the low light. A priest offers you a small cake sweetened with dates and flavoured with coriander. You bite into it, the sugar waking your mouth in slow waves. Joke too tilts an eyebrow. You wonder if the gods get the first batch of cakes or just the leftovers once the priests have done quality control. At the sanctuary's heart, the god's image rests in a small gilded shrine, its doors closed. Around it, offerings are arranged like a miniature market. Jars of oil, bolts of linen, carved figurines, baskets of fruit. The air feels heavier here, not oppressive, but deliberate, as though the walls themselves are holding their breath. You retrace your steps, past pools and palm shadows, back to the jetty. The ferryman is already waiting, sail ready to catch the northbound current. You board, feeling the heat of the temple's lamps still on your face, even in the cool river breeze. As you drift downstream, the night is quieter. The fields now only silhouettes against the sky. A crocodile slides into the water with a sound like a wet sigh, leaving a slow V in the moon's reflection. You grip the boat's side, remembering, with a grin, how Egyptian women once used crocodile dung mixed with honey as a form of contraceptive. Historians still argue whether this was truly effective or simply a method that guaranteed intimacy came with negotiations. Joke 3 settles in beside you. You think that if you'd lived here, you'd have asked the gods for bread, beer, and a crocodile-free bed. The current carries you toward a cluster of lanterns marking the riverbank, where the workers' village sleeps. You step ashore, the sand still warm under your soles, and glance back. The temple's outline remains in the distance, steady as the constellations above it, while the river hums its eternal double-direction song. Morning breaks with the sound of gulls, or at least you think they're gulls, until the cry shifts into something throatier, almost like a laugh. You're no longer by the Nile, you're standing in a city of marble and clay, where the air smells of olive oil, smoke, and damp stone. The sea glitters beyond a row of low buildings, and between you and the water, a crowd is gathering. They press toward a small open space flanked by columns. It's not grand enough to be a temple, but it has a kind of authority. Painted boards, simple benches, a low stage of worn planks. You take a seat on the edge, the wood smooth and warm from years of use. The chatter around you is lively, full of anticipation, punctuated by bursts of laughter before the performance even begins. Mainstream fact arrives right on cue. In ancient Greece, street theatre was as common as formal drama in great stone amphitheatres, often performed during festivals like Dionysia, where even humble stalls became stages for comic sketches and moral tales. A young man in a tunic hurries past you, face already dusted white with chalk. He carries a mask, large, exaggerated features, mouth open wide as if permanently mid-gasp. When he slips it over his head, his voice booms, the mask's hollow interior acting like a megaphone. Historians still argue whether the earliest masks were purely functional for projection, or if they evolved more for the recognisable character types audiences loved. The first scene begins with two actors in mismatched sandals arguing over a goat. The dialogue full of absurd metaphors and sly jabs at the local magistrate. A dog wanders on stage uninvited, sniffing at the goat's tail and earning the first genuine laugh of the morning. Joke 1 slips in beside you. You realise that ancient improv rules are the same as modern ones. If an animal joins the scene, it's instantly the star. The play shifts to a moral tale. A merchant cheats his customer, then receives poetic justice when the gods meddle in the form of a sudden ridiculous storm. The rain is nothing more than a boy on the roof shaking a basket of water-soaked sponges, but the crowd gasps and ducks all the same. The actors exaggerate every motion, turning clumsiness into art. A fringe tidbit pops up. Some scholars believe these street plays doubled as political commentary, sneaking critiques into harmless-seeming humour to avoid trouble with officials. Between acts, vendors weave through the crowd. One sells figs from a shallow basket, another offers a cone of roasted chickpeas wrapped in paper. The smell is irresistible, so you buy a handful, their skins blistered and salty. A musician with a lyre plays a short tune, his fingers dancing across the strings, while a child beats time on a clay drum. The rhythm is simple, but it stitches the crowd together like thread through cloth. The second act begins, and this one's more chaotic. A clumsy hero attempts to woo a princess while misinterpreting every piece of advice given to him. The princess rolls her eyes so hard you can hear it in her voice, and the crowd roars. Joke 2 wanders in. You note that apparently romantic comedy has been thriving for 2,500 years, complete with misunderstandings, bad poetry, and people falling over stools. The final scene wraps with a dance. Actors, musicians, and even a few audience members pulled into a ring. Someone grabs your hand, and suddenly you're part of it, feet stamping in time to the lyre, the rhythm vibrating up your legs. The mask next to you turns, exaggerated eyes fixed on your face, and you're not sure whether to laugh or bow. You do both. When the play ends, the crowd disperses into the narrow streets, still chattering about favourite moments. You wander after them, following the sound of a market. Stalls lean into the path, heavy with olives, fresh bread, painted pottery, and bolts of linen dyed deep red and blue. The air is thick with competing aromas, grilled fish, honey cakes, and a faint medicinal tang from an herbalist's cart. One stall has a display of masks for sale, some comic, some tragic, some so grotesque you can't imagine wearing them in daylight. The seller explains that these are modelled on the traditional stock characters, the boastful soldier, the miserly old man, the cunning slave. You try one on and nearly frighten yourself in a polished bronze mirror. Historians still argue whether audiences believed these masks carried a kind of magic, binding performer and roll together for the length of the play. The sun dips lower, casting golden light into the alleyways. A troupe sets up for the evening performance. Their stage a few cratons and a blanket stretched between poles. The leader, a wiry man with an easy grin, calls out to passers-by, promising a story of fools, fortune, and fish. You're tempted to stay, but the scent of the sea tugs you back toward the shoreline. Down by the water, fishing boats sway against their moorings, sails now furled tight. A group of children reenact the play you just saw, complete with a very confused goat stand-in, a boy wearing a sack. They stumble over the lines but nail the physical comedy, sending their audience, mostly other children, into fits of laughter. Joke 3 winks at you. You think these kids could sell tickets by tomorrow, especially if they keep the goat. As the light fades, the city hums with overlapping voices, music drifting from taverns, and the occasional clatter of amphorae being loaded for the morning market. You make your way through the crowd, the day's laughter still in your chest, the echo of the masked actors' voices somewhere between your ears and the sea breeze. The sea smell follows you inland, but the sound shifts, waves giving way to the steady, almost musical clink-clink of hammer on stone. You turn a corner and find yourself staring at a skeleton of columns, their bases rooted in a floor of veined marble, their tops crowned with wooden scaffolding. The building is incomplete, but even in this state, it radiates a kind of unshakable confidence. This is a Roman basilica under construction. Not the church kind that will come centuries later, but the civic version, a place where law, trade and gossip will soon echo under one roof. The air is alive with activity. Teams of masons shaping blocks, carpenters fitting beams, labourers carrying mortar in baskets, balanced on their shoulders. Mainstream fact comes in. Roman basilicas were central public halls in most cities, their rectangular layouts adapted later by early Christians for worship spaces. You step carefully between piles of stone and stacks of timber. A mason beckons you closer, offering a chisel for you to try. You strike the edge of a marble block and feel the vibration run through your arms, the sound sharp enough to make the gulls overhead call back in confusion. Joke 1 chips in. You realise you've just contributed exactly one useless groove to a very expensive column. The foreman explains the design through sweeping gestures. Rows of columns supporting a tall nave, with clear story windows to let in light, side aisles for vendors and legal clerks, and an apse at one end where magistrates will hear cases. A fringe tidbit floats by. Some basilicas doubled as indoor markets, with shop stalls lining the aisles so you could buy olive oil and then sue your neighbour for stealing your amphora in the same building. At one side of the site, a group of men fit wooden pegs into the base of a column drum before levering it upright. They work with ropes and pulleys, their motions synchronised like dancers. A block creaks into place, the sound both satisfying and nerve-wracking. Historians still argue whether ancient cranes were capable of lifting the heaviest blocks in one piece, or if they relied more on rolling and stacking smaller segments. The smell of fresh cut wood draws you toward the carpenter's area. Here beams are being planed smooth, sawdust gathering in golden drifts underfoot. A boy no older than 12 sands a piece with quiet focus, the grain emerging like waves on a pale shore. He glances up, grins, and offers you a handful of figs from a cloth pouch. You take one. It's soft, sweet, and sticky enough to glue your fingers together. Joke 2 murmurs. Clearly OSHA wasn't a thing, because he's sanding, eating, and probably holding up a beam all at once. Near the future entrance, a scribe sits cross-legged, recording deliveries in a wax tablet. His stylus scratches softly as he tallies stone loads, timber lengths, and, judging by his frown, the mysterious disappearance of a hammer. You watch as a labourer tries to convince him that it was borrowed by the gods, which earns only an unimpressed arch of the eyebrow. The midday sun pushes you into the shade of a partially completed colonnade. Here, a vendor has set up a makeshift stall, selling bread rounds, split and stuffed with herbs, cheese and olives. The bread is warm from the griddle, the cheese just beginning to melt, and you wonder if the entire basilica project is fueled by carbs. By late afternoon, the foreman calls a halt. Tools are stacked, ropes coiled, and the scaffolding quiets. Workers sprawl in the shade, sharing food and passing a skin of watered wine. You sit with them, your back against a block, still warm from the sun. The conversation rolls easily from building techniques to local gossip, and you catch a story about a runaway goat that somehow ended up on the scaffolding last week. Historians still argue whether these kinds of tales were exaggerated to entertain or actually common hazards in cities where animals roamed freely. When the shadows grow long, you walk to the edge of the site for a wider view. The unfinished basilica already dominates the square, its framework casting a striped shadow over the cobblestones. You try to imagine it complete, cool inside, bustling with citizens arguing cases or buying grain, sunlight pouring down through high windows. Joke 3 settles in as you leave. If you'd lived here, you might have started a side hustle selling fig bread at the door, just to catch people who were hungry before their court hearings. The sea is visible again as you descend toward the harbour, sails now silhouetted against the evening sky. Behind you, the basilica skeleton stands firm, waiting patiently for its marble skin and the hum of voices that will one day fill its ribs. The harbour is a tangle of sound before it's anything else. Ropes slapping against masts, gulls screaming overhead, the hollow thud of amphorae being set down too hard on planks. You walk along a row of moored ships, their hulls tar-darkened, smelling faintly of pine pitch, the wood creaking with the small constant shifts of tide. Beyond the ships, the open water glitters under the morning sun, dotted with sails like scraps of parchment. One vessel in particular catches your attention. Its bow is carved into the shape of a horse's head, ears pricked as if ready to gallop straight into the horizon. The captain, a wiry man with skin like old rope, waves you aboard without ceremony. Mainstream fact rides in with the tide. Roman merchant ships of this era could carry hundreds of amphorae of wine, olive oil, or grain, and their design balanced speed with cargo space for the Mediterranean's busy trade routes. You step onto the deck and are immediately hit with the rich, yeasty smell of fermented goods. Rows of amphora, their clay bellies sealed with resin, line the hold. The captain explains through gestures and a few words that the cargo is mixed. Oil for the north, wine for the east, and a few crates of dyed cloth wrapped tight against the salt air. A fringe tidbit drifts in. Archaeologists have found shipwrecks, with amphorae still sealed. Their wine technically intact, but tasting, according to one unfortunate taster, like liquid barnyard. The sailors work quickly to ready the ship, their bare feet darting over the deck with practiced ease. Ropes are coiled, sails unfurled, and the smell of salt grows sharper as the wind picks up. You're handed a rope to haul, and joke one hits you. You've just joined the Roman gig economy without signing a single contract. As the ship eases from the harbour, the water deepens to a bluer blue, and the city begins to shrink behind you. The captain points to the coastline, small villas dotting the hills, terraced gardens, and stretches of rocky shore where fishermen cast lines from precarious ledges. Dolphins surface alongside the hull, keeping pace for a few beats before diving again, their sleek backs catching the sun. The wind is steady, but it's not all smooth sailing. A crewman shouts, gesturing toward a dark shape floating ahead. It's a cluster of seaweed tangled with driftwood, but the cautious change of course hints at what's on everyone's mind. Pirates. Historians still argue whether piracy in the Roman Mediterranean was as constant a threat as ancient texts claim, or if some accounts exaggerated danger to justify Rome's military expansion. The day lengthens, and the work rhythm becomes hypnotic. Adjust the sail, check the ropes, scan the horizon, repeat. Midday brings a pause for food. Flatbread, olives, dried figs, and a wedge of sharp cheese. The bread is tough, but the figs are sweet enough to make up for it. A sailor offers you watered wine from a leather skin, the tang of it sharp in your throat. Joke 2 sidles in. This is the ancient version of an in-flight meal, minus the tray table, and with much better scenery. By late afternoon, the ship reaches its next stop, a small coastal port. The water here is shallow, so the cargo is ferried ashore in smaller boats. You join in, passing amphorae from hand to hand until they disappear into the bustle of the dock. The smell changes again, tar and salt giving way to fish being cleaned, spices ground in open-air stalls, and the faint floral scent of crushed herbs. You wander briefly through the port's market, spices mound in clay bowls, saffron, cumin, and something sharp enough to sting your nose. Fishmongers call out their catches, holding up glistening eels and fat red mullet. At one stall, a woman sells small pastries stuffed with nuts and honey. You buy one and nearly burn your tongue on the molten filling. Back aboard, the crew prepares for the night leg of the journey. The sun dips, painting the sea in streaks of gold and crimson. Lanterns are lit, swinging from the rigging, casting pools of warm light on the deck. The air cools, and the rhythm of the waves against the hull grows louder in the quiet. A sailor leans on the rail beside you, pointing to the stars. He traces shapes, Orion, the Pleiades, a scattering he calls the sea goat. Mainstream fact glimmers. Ancient sailors navigated by the stars long before compasses, using constellations as steady markers on otherwise featureless waters. Joke 3 drifts in as the horizon fades. You're suddenly glad you're not in charge of steering. Left to your sense of direction, you'd probably deliver the wine to Greenland. The ship glides on, the wake foaming softly in the moonlight. You rest against a coil of rope, the deck rocking you into a half-doze, the air salted and cool. Somewhere far ahead another port waits, and with it another set of voices, smells, and stories to carry back to shore. The road announces itself with a blister, small, ambitious, and determined to collect friends. You adjust the thong of your sandal, mutter an apology to your feet, and keep walking because the whole point of a pilgrimage is that you keep walking. The morning air is cool, the sky undecided, and your pack is exactly one loaf of bread too heavy. A scallop shell, one from a market stall because you like the curve of it, hangs from your cloak string, tapping your chest in a slow, encouraging rhythm. Somewhere ahead is a shrine, a relic, a promise of grace. Somewhere behind is a bed you didn't appreciate enough. Pilgrims have a way of sorting themselves into moving conversations. You fall in beside a miller with a cane polished by years of fingers, and a widow whose shawl smells faintly of lavender. Your rosemary sprig from the festival is tucked in your satchel. When you brush it accidentally, a green breath escapes, and you remember how nights can be kind if you give them a scent and a song. The miller tells you he's walked this road 3 times, once for my soul, once for my son, and once because my friends wouldn't stop bragging. Joke one clears its throat. You say you're here for the full package, soul, son I don't have, and bragging rights. The path threads through hedgerows stitched with dew, then climbs into open country where the wind has opinions. Your sandals do that slap-flap that says, "We were not designed by architects." You pass a field where geese patrol like moral authorities, and a cottage whose doorframe sprouts bundles of herbs, the universal language for "winter happened, we fought back." The road is dotted with waymarkers carved with crosses and arrows. Even the stones here practice evangelism. A mainstream fact sets its pack down beside you. From the Middle Ages onward, major routes, Canterbury to Thomas Becket, Compostela to St. James, Rome to the tombs of Peter and Paul, knitted Europe into a web of steady feet. Pilgrims went for penance, for cures, for adventure, for a vow made in a reckless moment. Along the way sprang hospices and xenodochia, guest houses run by monks or townsfolk, where a bowl of pottage and a pallet of straw could feel like proof that the world was not, in fact, trying to kill you. At noon you reach one of those houses, a stone hall with a smoky hearth, and a steward who signs your badge with a notch only the pious and the pedantic could love. He ladles you stew that is 90% optimism and 10% turnip. It tastes better than it sounds. On a bench near the fire, a man carefully threads a lead tin badge onto his cord, tiny shrine stamped in relief, edges still warm from the mould. A fringed tidbit wanders in. Pilgrims sometimes collected amply, little flasks filled with oil or water from a holy site, worn at the chest. Sailors later melted badges into their gear for luck, which might be why your stew tastes faintly of metallurgy. Back on the road, the talk turns to relics. The widow has a quiet list: Saint so-and-so's finger bone for a cough, another saint's veil for childbed protection, a footstep imprinted in rock where an angel allegedly paused to adjust a sandal. You listen, letting belief and practicality braid themselves like basket reeds. Historians still argue whether many relics were genuine remains, symbolic stand-ins, or enterprising forgeries that got out of hand. Yet the effect on travellers was documented in simpler language. Hope felt heavier on the way in, lighter on the way out. Clouds pull over the sun, and the wind sharpens. You wrap your cloak closer and study the ground the way you'd study a face, learning which pebbles are trouble, which patches of mud are more philosophy than soil. Your feet keep reporting, and you keep filing their complaints in the drawer labelled later. A tinker passes with clattering pans. He sells you a dab of salve that smells of tallow and mint and swears it will make your blisters repent of their sins. You decide any theology that includes mint is worth trying. By late afternoon, the road rises toward a hill town whose church tower peaks like a spyglass over tile roofs. Bells spill down the slope, 3 notes, patient and bright. At the gate, a woman with a ledger asks names and places. People volunteer stories instead, because pilgrims are walking libraries with poor cataloguing habits. You give your name and almost add "and coal-eyed," remembering that Egyptian market stall and how your eyelids once drew straight lines while your feet did not. Inside the church, the air is a pocket of beeswax and stone cool. Candles ripple along the nave like a low constellation. At the side altar, a reliquary glitters, a silver arm shaped like an arm, palm lifted in blessing, crystals winking under candle flame. You step closer and feel something you won't explain later without sounding dramatic. The hush of many hearts stacked, one upon another, like careful bread. You touch the scallop shell at your chest. It taps back as if to say, "Still walking." A priest speaks of indulgences in calm, measured words, days or years remitted from penance. the ledger of sin and sorrow balanced by acts of devotion. You don't cling to the math, you cling to the idea that walking and praying and sharing bread can unbend a spine the confessional couldn't reach. Historians still argue whether indulgences mainly comforted the faithful or funded a long list of church projects. Answer: both, with a side of pamphlet wars to come. But today, your coin stings less leaving your hand than it would paying a reeve. At the pilgrim house, you find a bunk, wide as a hope, long as a sigh. Someone has platted rushes with time, and you grin at the memory of the noble hall's rushes as a service, because even here the floor wants to smell like a garden that won a bar fight. A kindly woman inspects your feet with battlefield triage, pricks a blister, and ties on clean cloth. Joke too leans against the doorframe. You vow to dedicate the rest of your life to inventing socks. Supper is bread, beans, and a story. A grey-bearded mason tells of arriving at Santiago, washing his hands in a stone basin polished by centuries, and feeling all at once lighter in the bones. He shows a badge, a scallop pressed into lead, edges worn by fingers. Another pilgrim swears the holy well he visited bubbled the moment he lowered his cup. A third nods soberly and says, wells do that when the wind sneaks in. Faith and physics share the bench without competing for the ladle. Night drapes the rafters. A dozen sleepers breathe in a fug of wool, wood smoke, and dreams. You lie awake a little longer, counting the aches like rosary beads. Out of habit, you inventory your pockets. Rosemary sprig, shell, a crumb of date cake from that river temple night. A chip of stone you refuse to admit came from the road crew at the basilica site. The world has been mailing you talismans, and you have not returned any to sender. Before sleep, you whisper a deal to the dark. One more day of decent weather, one more kind hearth, one more strip of road that doesn't turn to glue. Joke 3 yawns softly. You add one more sausage that won't fight back, remembering the arena vendor's grin and your brave, foolish tongue. At dawn, the house unknots, belts buckled, cords tied, the quiet choreography of people who must move before they think. You dip your hand in the door's holy water, which is colder than manners require, and step into a sky the colour of unbaked bread. Your sandals hesitate, then agree. Your knees file a formal complaint, duly stamped and ignored. The shell taps its metronome. The road answers with dust, and you go forward, because forward is where the prayers are hung, like little flags. Behind you, the bells begin again, 3 notes, patient and bright, and the hill releases you back to the long, persuading plain. The relic's memory settles at your shoulder, equal parts warmth and weight. You don't feel transformed, you feel accompanied, which might, you decide, be how transformation actually starts. The plain eventually folds into green slopes, and the slopes into something grander, stone teeth biting up into a sky so clean it almost hums. You've left the road for a goat track, yes, that wanders upward without hurry, as if the mountain doesn't care how long you take to meet it. The air thins just enough to taste, and the light seems to sharpen on the edges of everything. Pine needles, rock faces, the quick silver wink of a stream, tumbling through moss. You stop to drink from that stream, cupping your hands in the way you've done since the Nile, though here the water bites with cold, not silt. A herder passes with a dozen sheep and a dog that gives you the side eye of someone who's seen too many strangers. Mainstream fact steps neatly alongside. Mountain passes in the Middle Ages weren't just treacherous routes, they were lifelines, carrying pilgrims, traders, armies, and news between valleys and kingdoms. Alpine passes, like the great Saint Bernard. Bernard were maintained by hospices, where monks rescued snow-trapped travellers long before search and rescue had a logo. A scrap of path swings wide, giving you a view back over the valley you've climbed from. Patchwork fields stitched with hedgerows, smoke threads curling from hearths, and somewhere faintly, the silver line of the river you once followed toward a festival. You grin without meaning to. Distances here feel like they're stored in your bones, not just your legs. Up ahead, two travellers rest under a leaning pine. One, a man with boots patched in 3 colours of leather, offers you a chunk of hard cheese. The other, a girl no older than 15, has a satchel rattling with pebbles she claims are lucky from each place she's visited. Joke 1 rolls down the slope. You say that by the end of her trip, she'll either have the world's first portable fortress or the sorest shoulder in Christendom. The path narrows, pressing you against the mountain wall on one side and open air on the other. Far below, a stream catches light in a way that makes it look like it's moving faster than the wind. The girl points out a cluster of tiny figures, merchants leading pack mules, along a lower trail, the bells on the animals chiming faintly up to you. A fringe tidbit sidles in. Some passes were marked not with signposts but with stacks of stones, cairns that travellers would add to for luck and direction. You pass one now, balanced improbably on a ledge, its topmost pebble catching a streak of sunlight like it's been blessed. Clouds start to gather, smudging the peaks ahead. Historians still argue whether travellers in this era could accurately predict weather shifts, or if they simply learned to live with being surprised. The herder you met earlier would probably vote for goats know first. You crest a ridge to find a hospice built from the mountain itself. Thick stone walls, small windows, and a roof weighted with slabs to keep the wind from peeling it away. A monk in a wool robe greets you at the door, his cheeks ruddy from cold, his eyes the calm grey of slate. Inside, the air smells of broth and damp wool, and the fire hisses like it's been waiting all day just for your boots. You sit at a long table where bowls of steaming pottage appear without question. Barley, root vegetables, maybe a scrap of meat if the larder's generous. The monk ladling it out explains in a low voice that they keep dogs trained to find people trapped in snow. One such dog sprawls under the table now, massive and snoring, wearing the kind of dignity only a rescuer can pull off. Joke 2 curls around the hearth. You imagine this dog charging into a snowstorm with a tiny barrel of wine, only to be distracted by a rabbit halfway there. Outside, the wind is rising. The monk advises staying until morning, when the light is better and the ice less ambitious. You agree without hesitation. Mountains have a way of making even stubborn travellers polite. In the quiet of evening, you wander to the chapel. It's a single room, its altar a block of mountain stone, its walls painted with saints, who seem to lean forward, as if listening for footsteps. You light a taper and place it among the others, watching the flames flicker together like a conversation. Later, in a narrow bunk, you listen to the wind scrape against the shutters. The warmth from the hearth follows you, trapped in your blanket. Somewhere downstairs, the dog shifts in its sleep, nails clicking softly on stone. Historians still argue whether the great passes were more feared for their bandits or their avalanches. Lying here, you think the real danger is how easily they convince you to stop moving. Dawn comes pale and cold. The monk sees you off with bread, cheese, and a nod that feels heavier than words. The air outside is knife bright, the mountains edged in new snow. As you descend into the next valley, the sun climbs behind you, spilling light over your shoulder, as if to say you've earned this view. Joke 3 tags along. You consider telling everyone in the valley you just survived the highest peak in the world, leaving out the part where you did it in the company of a saintly dog and a bowl of soup. The path curves into shadow, then opens to a spread of rooftops and morning smoke. Somewhere down there, a new story waits. You let the shell at your chest tap its small steady beat and keep walking. The valley opens wide enough to swallow sound, yet the first thing you notice is the chatter of water. 2 rivers meeting in a lazy collision, swirling like dancers changing partners. Bridges rise here, 3 of them, each in a different state of loyalty to gravity. The nearest is a stout stone arch, its keystone carved with a weather-softened face that might be a saint, might be an old mayor, or might just be the mason's cousin who owed him money. You step onto the bridge, feeling the stone still cool from the night. Mainstream fact falls into step. Medieval bridges were more than crossings. They were commercial spines. Inns, chapels, even shops sprouted along their lengths, turning the span into a marketplace floating over water. Some towns built houses directly on the arches, timber-framed rooms jutting out so far you'd swear they were daring the river to argue. Halfway across, a woman sells hot chestnuts from a brazier, their shells splitting with a hiss. You buy a paper twist of them, burning your fingertips, because patience has never been your department. She nods toward the next bridge, a wooden one with a roof, shingles weathered silver. Joke 1 shows up. She says the roof is to keep the bridge dry, and you have to admire her commitment to deadpan architecture humour. On the far bank, the street tightens into an arcade of stalls. Fish laid out on beds of rushes, baskets of onions stacked like cannonballs. A man hawking ribbons, dyed in colours so bright they seem to hum. You pass a stall selling honey and combs, the vendor slicing golden squares that drip into shallow bowls. A fringed tidbit clings to your sleeve. In some towns, bridge tolls were partly paid in goods. Fish, grain or candles offered to maintain the structure, or to fund the little chapel that often perched above mid-span. The chapel here is a modest stone alcove halfway along the bridge. Inside, the air smells faintly of beeswax and the damp breath of the river. A painted Madonna watches over travellers, her robes blue faded toward grey, but her eyes still fixed and bright. Pilgrims have left offerings, shells, coins, a small carved boat, tokens for safe passage, not just across water, but through whatever lay beyond it. Historians still argue whether these bridge chapels were built mainly for spiritual comfort, or as visible markers of civic pride. Both seem plausible when you stand inside, hearing the hum of footsteps through the floor. You wander to the third bridge, older and less sure of itself. Its arches are low and uneven, and the stones shift slightly under your weight, as though the bridge has developed opinions about strangers. A boy sits on the parapet, legs dangling over the current, whittling a stick into the vague shape of a fish. He glances up and tells you, without being asked, that this bridge is haunted by a mason who struck a deal with the devil for speed, then tricked him by letting the first soul to cross be a dog. The dog, he says, still howls under the arches on moonless nights. Joke 2 paddles in. You ask whether the dog still gets toll exemptions. The boy doesn't smile, but you catch the twitch of amusement before he looks away. You cross back into the market square, the bridges now behind you like ribs of a giant stone creature. Merchants call out in a dozen accents. The scent of the river, weaving with frying fish, baking bread, and the sharp tang of vinegar from a pickle barrel. At a stall near the quay, you buy a small clay cup of ale and lean against a post to watch the boats. Some are flat-bottomed barges carrying wool bales, others are narrow fishing craft slipping under the arches, with nets drawing like ghostly sails. A barge master complains loudly to anyone listening about the new toll rates, apparently doubled since some bishop decided his wine cellar needed a scenic view. You watch as he argues with the toll collector, who counts coins with the same patience as water-shaping stone. Historians still argue whether toll inflation drove merchants to seek alternate routes, or simply encouraged more creative bookkeeping. As evening folds in, the bridges take on new lives. Lanterns are lit along the stone arch, their reflections trembling in the dark water. Lovers lean on parapets, traders count the day's earnings, and somewhere beneath the chapel's floor, the river keeps its steady hymn. You pause at the centre of the main span, watching the current catch the lantern light and carry it downstream. The air smells of smoke and roasted chestnuts, the kind of scent that will attach itself to your cloak and refuse to leave. Joke 3 walks you toward the far bank. You think about how bridges are supposed to connect people, yet somehow always seem to connect you to the next opportunity to spend money. Beyond the last row of stalls, the road picks up again, dust waiting under your boots. The river's voice fades, replaced by the steady rhythm of your steps and the occasional creak of your pack. Behind you, the three bridges glow in the dark like a trio of stubborn stars, holding their places against the pull of the water. You find the tavern by ear, long before you find it by door, the soft saw of a bow on a rebec, a lute testing a shy chord, a drum tapping the floorboards like knuckles on a friendly table. The sign above the lintel swings in the dusk, creaking as if it's already tipsy. Inside, warmth blooms against your cheeks. A crowded perfume of wood smoke, yeast-damp cloaks, and something frying in fat that may or may not be a vegetable. Rushes hush your footsteps. Lavender crushed just enough to remind you of the noble hall's rushes as a service. Only here the service plan includes spilled ale and an occasional chicken feather. A bench opens at the back wall, a mercy, and you slide into it, your pilgrim shell tapping your chest like a metronome that refuses to clock out. A serving girl in a linen cap sets down a clay mug without ceremony. The ale is pale, foaming, and slightly sour in a way that says, cleaner than the well, more than it says delicious. You drink anyway. Warmth settles into your stomach as if you just dropped a small sun down there for later. The music starts proper. 3 players now. A lute with honeyed strings, a pipe that climbs like a kite, and a tabor whose heartbeat keeps the room stitched together. A bearded man in a hood slides a stool nearer and begins a story song, his voice with that rough edge that says he's sung it often enough to sand it smooth. Mainstream fact wanders in and hangs its cloak by the fire. Taverns and alehouses doubled as community rooms in much of medieval Europe. Places for travellers to land, for guilds to meet, for news to unspool, and itinerant minstrels carried tunes between towns the way merchants carried pepper. At the next table, 2 carters argue about bridge tolls. Apparently, the saint in the chapel charges by the ox now, while a weaver fingers a ribbon of bright dye like it's a prayer rope. A sleeping dog under the table gives a snore so emphatic that the pipe player giggles into his note and turns it into a trill. Joke 1 pads across the rushes. You decide the dog has the best lungs in the room and would ace the frigidarium plunge if the Romans ever franchised baths out here. The ballad turns bawdier without collapsing into trouble. Wink more than wallop. Laughter keys the room brighter, and the serving girl sweeps back with a trencher. Dark bread, fried onions, a strip of pork that crackles at the edges. You tear the bread, the crust reminding your teeth that life's a workout, and breathe in steam that smells faintly of rosemary. You tuck that festival sprig into your satchel for luck, but tonight the kitchen beat you to it. A tall fellow in a patched green cloak offers to trade you a story for your last onion. You counter with a half onion for a half story, and he agrees like a man who bargains for sport. He tells you about a winter so sharp the mill race froze solid, and the villagers played skittles on the ice until the reeve declared it sinful because he was losing. You hand over the onion and keep the ending for your private anthology. Near the hearth, the lutenist shifts to a tune you know without knowing, one of those melodies that seems to have been waiting behind your ribs. Your foot joins the floor's conversation. Your hand learns the tabletop's beat. Historians still argue whether such earworms travelled mainly with professional minstrels or with apprentices and soldiers. Everybody, with feet spreading tunes like burrs on a cloak. Either way, the song settles on the room like shared weather. The ale warms your ears enough to make the candlelight feel a degree softer. The tabor starts a circle dance near the doorway. Nothing ambitious, just a turn and back and a polite skip that even your pilgrimage blisters can manage. You join hands with a baker who smells like tomorrow's loaf and a widow who laughs like she's paid for the right to keep laughing. Round you go, the floor flexing like a ship's deck, and for a moment you could be on that Roman merchantman again, only wetter inside and with fewer amphorae. When the tune resolves, The rebec player leans forward with a conspiratorial grin and launches a quick, clever song about a miller, a jealous goose, and a missing shoe. The chorus is nonsense in all the ways that feel necessary. You learn it, then pretend you didn't, then sing it anyway. Joke 2 taps your shoulder. You vow to introduce this chorus to the Colosseum sausage vendor, who could sell twice as many links if he set them to this rhythm. A man with a scar like an old river across his cheek asks the room for quiet and lifts a small wooden flute. The melody he plays is thin as thread and twice as strong. The tavern doesn't so much hush as lean closer. The tune climbs a narrow stair to a place in your throat that knew how to ache even before today. When it softens to a stop, the silence feels like a held breath, and then the room lets it go together. You wipe at your eye because the smoke is clearly opinionated. A fringe tidbit sidles up with its tankard. In some towns, civic orders tried to police alehouses, curfews for songs, bans on dice, limits on how many cups before fines, because music and drink make plans braver than daylight. The tavern keeper here enforces his own code. Keep the stools upright, keep your hands polite, keep the chorus loud enough that the reeve across the lane knows his quiet isn't compulsory. The serving girl swings by to top your mug and notices the scallop shell at your collar. "Santiago?" she asks. You say, "Not yet," and she taps the rim of your cup with a fingernail. "Then practice," she says, as if walking were a taste you acquire. You think of the hospice dog with the heroic snore and the mountain chapel flames leaning together. The tavern's candles do the same, little conspirators in glassless windows. Two travellers start a brag off at the hearth, who's crossed the worst pass, who's seen the longest bridge, who's eaten the most terrifying eel. You toss in that you once saw a crocodile slip into a moonlit river and felt your heart forget which century it belonged to. That wins at least a respectful nod. Then someone claims he played for a lady in a gown lined with miniver and she cried into a cinnamon wafer. The lutenist rolls his eyes but plays sad song anyway, because tips. Later, the pipe yields to a drum with sheepskin stretched tight, and the room decides to be rowdy without declaring war. Dice tick against wood. A boy sleeps face down on his folded arms, ponytail in the puddle of his own snores. Someone near the door insists on explaining, for the third time, that the best way to keep ale fresh is to drink it quickly. The room applauds what it was going to do regardless. Mainstream detail returns with a friendly nudge. Much of the repertoire you hear, dance tunes, broadside ballads, saints' legends, trimmed to a singable length, will mutate over the years, stolen and reseeded, until centuries later, people will argue about which version is original. You decide the answer is the one being sung in the room that needs it. Near closing, the keeper dampens the hearth with a practiced splash and calls last cups. The dog under the table issues a final operatic snore. Encore requested, encore delivered. Cloaks find shoulders, coins find palms, promises to meet next market day find air. You pull on your own cloak, still faintly perfumed with time from some floor you loved, and feel the tavern's heat loosen its fingers as the door opens tonight. Outside, the lane smells of wet stone and reheated moonlight. From inside, one last chord shivers the shutter and slips out to walk with you a few steps. Joke 3 drapes an arm around your shoulder. You consider telling tomorrow's you that tonight's chorus was research, strictly medicinal, approved by 3 saints and a reeve, and absolutely necessary for foot health. You head for your pallet, with music still perched behind your ear, like a small patient bird. The night folds itself around your shoulders, friendly as a well-worn cloak, and somewhere between one remembered chorus and the next, you float to sleep. Feet forgiving, heart tuned, breath keeping time with a drum that isn't quite done yet. Morning drifts in like a gentle apology for last night's songs, and you follow the ribbon of crowd noise toward a square you haven't seen before. Half market, half workshop, all curiosity. Here hammers are polite, They tap rather than shout. Brass gleams where cloth has been rubbed over and over by proud hands. Someone cranks something that huffs a thread of steam, as if annoyed to be awake. You step into the shade of a striped awning and immediately lose the ability to pretend you're not 8 years old. A man with ink-stained fingers beckons you. On his table sits a shallow bronze bowl with a single upright pin. He fills the bowl with water, sets a tiny fish-shaped spoon upon it, and blows once. The spoon spins, then slowly settles, its tail finding the same direction each time. It points, he says, tapping the pin. Not to gossip, but to the road. A mainstream fact tidies its spectacles. Early magnetic compasses appear in ancient China, first as lodestones that float or pivot, and later as navigational aids, turning the mystery of direction into a usable habit. You lean closer. The spoon keeps its secret language, but keeps pointing too, as if it knows something about your pilgrim shell that you don't. Across the aisle, a woman winds a brass cylinder and lets go. The cylinder's teeth catch a comb of little tines. A melody tumbles out, bright and plucky. For the babies, she says, and for the fathers who pretend it's for the babies. She shows you a larger box, carved cypress, a crank like a ship's handle. When she turns it, tiny bronze birds pop from the lid, fluttering on invisible wires, beaks opening and closing to click a brittle song. She winks. Hero taught us half the tricks. You remember the baths of section 16, and a fringe tidbit hops the splash. Hero of Alexandria wrote of coin-operated holy water dispensers, theatrical automata, and the Aeolipile, a steam whirligig that spins like a toy galaxy, which no one treated as a power source, because sometimes a miracle arrives too early and wearing party clothes. The crowd parts for a man rolling a large wooden-framed disc, glittering with green-brown gears the size of dinner plates. His apprentice carries a box of pins and a bundle of stars cut from thin copper. Calendar, the man announces. Sun and moon, maybe wanderers. He gestures at 5 smaller dials chasing each other like dogs around a mill pond. You touch the metal, slick with oil. For sailing, you ask. He shrugs. For knowing? For not being surprised. Historians still argue whether the Antikythera mechanism, bronze gears fished from a shipwreck, predicted eclipses, tracked planetary cycles, or simply proved that brains can carve the sky into cogs. You watch the man nudge a gear, and the whole face of the heavens advance by a fingertip. Farther on, a boy kneels beside a shallow trough scattered with barley. He turns a crank, a screw-shaped cylinder, lifts water from a lower basin to a higher one, kissing the grains with a thin, bright stream. Gardens, he says, grinning. The Archimedes screw hums like a friendly idea, simple, inevitable. You feel your shoulders loosen at the sight of water going where you ask it. You think of the monastery's herb beds and the hospice dog's mountain, of fields brittle with hail, and decide there's a sort of prayer that sounds like a turning handle. The next table smells pleasantly of cedar. A carpenter shows you a box full of discs pierced with holes, each disc marked with neat scratches. He stacks them on a peg, drops a string through, and pulls. The string snakes through in a path that spells a number in a code of his own making. He calls it an accounting trick, and the scribe from the basilica would weep for joy if he saw it. A girl beside him spins an abacus frame so fast the beads blur, then stops it with a slap that solves the carter's bill to the last fig. You suspect the abbots and toll collectors of the world have already placed their orders. A man in a soot-kissed apron slides you a small jar sealed with wax. Inside, a copper rod dips into a roll of tin foil around a clay core, the whole jar filled with vinegar. Make hair stand, he promises. You raise an eyebrow. He touches 2 wires to a thin strip of leaf. It shivers and lifts. Baghdad lightning, he whispers. You've heard of the so-called Baghdad battery, and you file this under intriguing, debatable, and please don't lick it. Fringe tidbit indeed, Whether these jars were batteries, electroplating kits, or clever storage vessels with delusions of grandeur remains a party conversation for future scholars. Under a canvas lean-to, an old woman uses an astrolabe like a musician tuning a night. She adjusts the rotating plate over a star map and tilts it toward the noon sun, then reads the latitude as easily as a recipe. She lets you hold it, heavy, cool, edges worn like river stones, the math baked into brass like bread into crust. Ships, she says. Prayer times, she adds. Then, with a sly glance at your shell, and knowing whether you can reach the next hospice before your blister, invents a sermon. Joke one sidles up with a grin, and you promise your feet you'll consult the sky more often. Beyond the astrologer, a mason displays a tray of stones that look like cookies that could break your teeth. Roman recipe, he says, tapping a wedge shot with tiny, glittering pebbles. Concrete that laughs at time. He dunks a sample in water, leaves it, and pulls out an older piece hardened like a stubborn opinion. Mainstream detail flexes. Roman concrete, especially the maritime variety, used volcanic ash that reacts with seawater to grow stronger over centuries, which is a rude fact to tell any dock builder who worships fresh timber. You imagine a pier quietly outliving the man who swore it would fail. A scholar in a blue-dyed mantle invites you to a display of papers pinned under stones. Time, she says, is for measuring. She shows you water clocks. A clay jar drips through a calibrated hole. The floating scale climbs and marks the hours. Another version uses a siphon whose song changes pitch across the day. She smiles at your wide eyes. Yes, they cheat, she admits. So do shadows. You recall the desert night when deacons, the small star groups, gave priests their sky clocks, and the thought makes you softer toward imperfect minutes. At a quieter stall, a smith holds up a dark rippled bar. Woots, he says, from far east, steel that drinks light. He lays a knife across your palm. It weighs less than your expectation. He speaks of carbon and quench, of a temper that walks a tightrope between brittle and brave. He hands you a second blade, pattern welded, and lets the ripple sing when he drags a fingernail across it. Your mind wanders to Mongol riders under cold stars, and you add clever metal to your private tally of things that travel faster than armies. On the square's rim, a quiet engineer bends over a clay model of a hill stitched with lines. He pours water into a hole on the high side. It vanishes into the hill and trickles from a little arch at the bottom. Kanat, he says, underground channels that carry mountain melt to thirsty fields. Shaded from the sun, so loss becomes patience. He explains vents for air and access, gentle gradients that keep water obedient. You imagine a village saved from an argument with summer. You imagine your rosemary sprig, heroic as any saint, thriving in that gift. Past midday, the sun pushes the crowd into the slivers of shade. You share a stall's bench with a mother bouncing a baby to the rhythm of a rotating spit that turns itself by cleverly stealing heat from the fire. The spit squeaks. The baby squeaks back. Joke 2 yawns awake. You decide this is the first machine built to amuse infants and feed their parents simultaneously. Approve, approve, approve. Someone demonstrates a seismoscope, Zhang Heng's bronze dragon jar, recreated with dragon heads facing the 8 winds and a ring of tiny balls resting in their mouths. When the earth grumbles, the man says, a ball drops toward the direction of its complaint. You are certain your cottage, with its opinionated floorboards, would empty the jar in an hour. Historians still argue whether surviving descriptions match this device exactly, or whether later storytellers polished the dragons. Either way, you respect any jar that listens better than people do. As shadows lengthen, a final hum gathers near a tent scripted with stars. Inside, a small planetarium spins. Rings traced with constellations circle a lamp that impersonates the sun. Children reach up, and make Orion wobble with sticky fingers. The keeper invites you to turn the crank. The spheres glide, each at its stubborn speed. You think of the monk's scraping vellum, of the leopard's shoulder in the arena, of the hospice dog's faithful snore. The world is a mess of miseries and wonders, but some minds insist on coaxing pattern from noise, grace from gears. On your way out, you pass a tray of little clay tubes wound with horsehair, whirl them and they buzz like angry bees. You buy one on impulse. When you spin it, the sound startles 3 pigeons and makes one toddler whoop. Joke 3 tips its hat. If armies carried these instead of trumpets, battles might end in laughter and extremely confused bees. You tuck the buzzing toy beside your scallop shell, weigh the brass astrolabe in your memory, and step back into the ordinary street. It feels less ordinary now, pricked with unseen mechanisms. Hidden screws, quiet siphons, a compass spoon lodged behind the day's face, always pointing. And you, still walking, are one more invention in motion. A machine of breath and stubbornness, calibrated by songs, warmed by soup, optimized by rosemary and the occasional miracle that squeaks when it turns. The road draws you toward the sound of wooden wheels clattering over cobblestones, and you arrive just as the fair spills open its arms for the day. Flags ripple overhead, reds and greens and golds that turn the sunlight into a quilt. The air already smells like sweet fritters, spiced wine, and whatever livestock diplomacy has allowed this close to the stalls. Someone calls out the day's contests, and a juggler tosses 3 brass cups as if daring gravity to lodge a complaint. You slip between 2 canvas booths and find yourself at a table stacked with glass baubles so bright they might be stolen from rainbows. A boy dips a long iron tube into a blob of molten glass and blows, slow, steady, until a bubble blooms, like a soap dream made solid. Mainstream fact sidles in. Venetian glassmakers on Murano guarded their techniques so fiercely that revealing them could mean exile, but their coloured glass and crystal-clear work turned the city into a glittering export machine. The boy spins the rod, and a drop of cobalt glints like a tiny sea trapped in the sun. Past the glass, a fiddler stands on a barrel, coaxing the crowd into a loose circle. 2 girls leap into a hopping dance, their skirts flashing the embroidered hems their mothers must have cursed at midnight. A tinker joins in, clattering tin ladles for percussion. You linger just long enough to spot joke 1. It's the barrel, clearly enjoying the best view in the square, and you half expect it to applaud when the tune ends. Near the centre, a row of trestle tables groans under bolts of cloth, wool dyed deep woad blue, madder red, and the sort of green you could plant in spring and harvest in autumn. A merchant strokes a length of silk so light it might escape if you exhale too sharply. He boasts of caravans that thread deserts, ships that dodge storms, and guildmasters who will duel with contracts to claim such treasure. Historians still argue whether these fairs were chiefly about exotic goods or about cementing alliances over ale and accounts, but the gleam in this man's eye suggests he enjoys both outcomes equally. At the far end, a row of pens holds animals for trade, geese muttering like old gossips, a goat with the confidence of a pope, and a pony the colour of storm clouds. A farmer tries to sell a pair of rabbits by insisting they are self-replenishing, which is both true and not the sales pitch you want to dwell on before lunch. You think back to the monastery gardens and imagine how quickly those rabbits would become a plague, and how much stew would result. You pause at a stall where a baker demonstrates a mechanical spit, turning rows of tiny cakes above a brazier. He hands you one, honey drizzled, warm, crisp at the edges. You burn your tongue anyway. A fringe tidbit arrives with the sweetness. In some fairs, bakers competed for novelty, shaping pastries into castles, animals, or saints, the latter sometimes wearing icing expressions that implied they were not entirely on board with the idea. A bit further, a booth offers miracle cures from a bearded man in a purple cap. He waves a jar of powder over your head, muttering syllables that might be Latin, might be yesterday's shopping list. He claims it will repel fleas, improve memory, and prevent accidental bee stings. The powder smells like rosemary, ash, and maybe regret. You nod politely and edge away before he suggests a bulk purchase. Joke 2 pops in. If his powder truly did all that, he wouldn't need to shout about it. He'd just whisper, and the fleas would leave from shame. In the shadow of the church, a row of scribes offers to write letters for a fee. One man works with his tongue, poking from the corner of his mouth, shaping the loop of a capital like it might try to wriggle away. You watch him blot the parchment with sand, shake it free, and pass it to a waiting girl who clutches it as though it's the very weight of love. You remember your own encounters with vellum and ink, and wonder how many words here are wrapped for secrecy, how many are seeds waiting for the right moment to sprout. The crowd thickens as a troupe of acrobats takes the open space. 2 men form a ladder of hands and shoulders, a third runs up it like it's a staircase, flips in the air, and lands on one foot atop the second man's head. The audience gasps in one voice. Mainstream fact straightens its tunic. Medieval fairs often hosted travelling entertainers, jugglers, fire breathers, and tumblers whose feats not only dazzled, but carried news and stories from far-off places. You clap along, but part of you still worries about that man's neck. A side alley off the main square reveals the quieter commerce of second chances. Tables heaped with worn boots, dented pots, and mismatched candle holders. A woman polishes a tarnished mirror until it winks back some of its old charm. You pick up a small wooden whistle, shaped like a bird. When you blow, it chirps once, then wheezes in defeat. You buy it anyway, thinking it might enjoy retirement in your satchel. At the largest tent, a crowd gathers for a mock trial, staged by a group of players. They drag a defendant, a fellow in exaggerated rags, before a judge in a borrowed fur collar. The charges: theft of the mayor's sausage, slander of the bishop's hat, and unlawful dancing in a restricted area. The defendant protests in rhyme. The judge sentences him to sing for his supper. The crowd howls. You stand at the edge, smiling at the way shared laughter knits strangers together faster than any trade deal. A merchant with a small cart of spices stops you, offers a pinch of something golden that smells like sunlight, and Pepper had an enthusiastic child. Saffron, he says, worth more than gold if you measure in weight. He tells you of crocus fields where each flower gives only 3 strands, and of guards set to watch over the harvest. Historians still argue whether saffron arrived here through Moorish Spain or Venetian traders first, but in this moment, the only certainty is that your nose feels like it just got a blessing. By mid-afternoon, the fair's music swells into a tangle of tunes. Fiddles, drums, the occasional bray of a horn that sounds like it's still deciding whether it's a musical instrument. You weave between booths, pockets lighter from coins but heavier, with bread, spice, and the bird whistle that will never chirp properly again. The flags above flicker in the breeze like impatient hands. Joke 3 walks you to the gate. You realise the fair is a brilliant invention designed to help you trade all your heavy coins for light, bulky objects that will now make your pack argue with your spine. But the smile stays on your face as you step away, the square still buzzing behind you, the flag still tossing colour into the sky, and the scent of honey cakes following you, like a rumour you'd be happy to spread. The path from the fair loosens into the hush of a meadow at dusk. The noise behind you folds smaller and smaller, until it is only the hum of your own memory. Market shouts, fiddle tunes, the wheeze of that bird whistle you probably overpaid for. Ahead, the sky slips from gold to the bruised purple that makes every hill look like it's keeping a secret. You follow the slow pull of a road that curves toward a ridge, each step pressing the day's coins and crumbs deeper into your pack. You crest the rise just as the last light spills into the valley. Below lies a scattering of cottages with roofs pitched like they're whispering together. A single wisp of smoke unwinds from a chimney, curling into the cool air. You pass the first garden, its rosemary scent waking a memory, from the monastery kitchens. A cat blinks at you from the path, decides you're boring, and returns to the important work of staring at nothing. Mainstream fact slips into place. Villages like this often grew along pilgrimage routes. Their small inns and bread ovens kept alive by the slow but steady traffic of travellers. A place like this survives on mutual need. Food for shelter, coins for a bed, news for a smile. You nod to an old man repairing a fence and he nods back. The unspoken language of people who know a road can be as binding as a contract. The inn has a crooked signboard, painted with a ship that might once have been blue. Inside, a long table waits, set with bread, cheese, and a pot of something thick and hopeful. The innkeeper slides you a bowl without asking your name. In villages like this, your face is your introduction. The stew tastes of lentils and herbs, with the faint heat of pepper that probably cost someone half a week's wages. At a corner bench, a man tells the room of a light that dances on the moor at midsummer, leading those who follow it to gold, or to bogs, depending on whether the story needs a moral. A fringe tidbit. Tales of will-o'-the-wisps may have sprung from real phenomena, gases from decaying plants that ignite when exposed to air. But their hold on the imagination outlasted any scientific explanation. You trade the story of the hospice dog's mountain for a slice of bread spread with honey so rich it nearly hums. The listeners lean in, passing the details back and forth like coins. Historians still argue whether these communal spaces were more about sustenance or storytelling, but you can see the two are bound together here. Food feeds the body, stories feed the night. The room quiets when someone begins to pluck a lute. The notes are soft, as if aware that outside the dark has settled fully, and the hills are leaning closer to listen. You feel your eyes grow heavy, the kind of weight that isn't just from walking, but from being thoroughly in the world. Dust in your boots, laughter in your ears, and the scent of rosemary still holding your sleeve like a friend's hand. Joke one drifts through your mind. You've seen medieval fairs, miraculous gadgets, and pilgrims' relics, yet nothing works better to quiet a room than bread, warm stew, and a lute in the corner. Your bed upstairs is narrow, the mattress uneven, but the linen smells faintly of sun from the line. The shutter is open to a sky salted with stars. Somewhere beyond the hills, rivers run under bridges lit with lanterns. In some far-off square, flags still stir above the stalls. You stretch once, letting the ache in your legs find its rhythm with the creak of the boards, and you think of the journey. Every misery and every wonder layered together until they feel like parts of the same song. Joke 2 taps your shoulder. Maybe they always were the same song, just different verses. The candle on the table burns low, its light tracing the curve of the scallop shell hanging from your pack. You watch it until your eyes blur. Outside, the cat is probably still winning its staring contest with the night. Somewhere in the distance, a will-o'-the-wisp might be flickering for someone else's story. And now, wind down begins. Your thoughts slow, as though the air itself has thickened to hold them gently. The sounds outside soften into the hush between one heartbeat and the next. Even the stars seem less like distant fires and more like lanterns hung at the edges of a great, quiet garden. You imagine following a path there, each step sinking slightly into cool grass, each breath deep and easy. The road behind you fades, not vanished, just folded away like a letter you've finished reading. The images from your journey drift past. The hospice dog's mountain, the rosemary in the kitchen, the bridges stitched across the river's back, the shimmer of glass in the fair. They slow, dissolve, leave behind only a warm weight in your chest. You feel the steadiness of the bed under you, the rhythm of your own breathing, the cool brush of night air across your skin. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the lute again, its melody wandering without hurry. The candle gutters, and the room seems to lean into the darkness. Outside, the hills keep their secrets. The road waits with quiet patience, and somewhere, the cat shifts, settling deeper into its own dreams. You let your eyes close, not with finality, but with the gentle certainty that this night, at least, will hold you safe. Sweet dreams.